Whether you are feeling totally lost with Next.js or have been already building something with it, this video is for you. Because to this video I have gathered a compilation of some of my most informative and hands-on tutorials from my Next.js 13 series. We will explore topics like basics of app router, authentication with NextAuth and the app router, route handler basics and advanced usage, adding internationalization using both server and client components, and also a complete tutorial on how to build a to-do list application using Next.js 13 and the app router. These are just some of the topics, and you can see the video description for the full list of things covered in this video. But before we start, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button below, and without further ado, let's get started. I hope you enjoy.
With the app directory, we can improve the routing in our Next.js applications, and we can use easily things like server components or layouts, for example. In this video, I want to show you how you can use the new app folder and the new routing, and how things like layouts and server components work. So let's dive in. So right here, I have a fresh Next.js application open, and as we can see, it uses the Next.js 13 version. So let's start by opening up the application in our local host and just see that it runs. Looks like everything is okay, so let's hop to the VS Code and see the folder structure. So up until now, every page has been defined inside of this pages folder. But with the Next.js 13, we can now create a new folder called app, and we can place our pages inside of this folder. So let's try it out. So in the app folder, I will just create a new file called page.js. And inside of it, I will export a React component like this, then save it and switch to the browser and refresh the page. And nothing happens, so let's try to actually boot the server, the dev server. Okay, and right here we get a warning saying that the app dir is experimental. So one thing I didn't mention is that at the moment it's still experimental and in beta. So this is why we need to add this experimental app dir true to the Next.js config. So let's do that. I'll open up the config and paste it in over here like this. Then I'll boot my server. And looks like we got some errors saying that there is conflicting app and page file. So right now the home route is pointing to this page and this page's index.js file. So let's get rid of this one. So it should hit this page.js file. So I'll remove that and I'll reboot my server. Okay, and we got a message that the app page did not have root layout. So Next.js created one for us. So it created this layout.js file. Let's look into that in just a second. But before that, let's hop to the browser and see if everything works. And looks like it does. We get the hello text over here. Okay, so our page.js is working. So what is this layout.js? So with the new app folder, we need to have this root layout inside of the app folder. And what this does is this basically replaces the app.js and document.js files. So as you can see right here, we have the HTML tags, head and body, and then we render the children inside of the body. So every application should have inside of the app folder this root layout. So let's add a navigation inside of this layout file just to see how it works. So I'll add some navigation code over here like this. So I added two links, home and posts, inside of the nav bar. So let's save it and switch to the browser, and we can see we have home and posts over here. So if we click home, it opens up the front page, and with the posts, it opens up the /posts page. And we don't have it yet, so let's create that one. So in the app folder, I will now create a new file inside of posts folder called page.js. So with this new routing, the segments in the URL, so for example here the posts, will no longer come from a file name, but rather from the folder names. And each folder should have a page file inside of it. And that's the file that will be rendered from that route. So now inside of this page file, I'll just export a function like this and save it, switch back to the browser, and we can see we have the post page over here. So home goes to the home and posts go to the post. Let's change the home page text just to home page like this. So over here now. Great. Now you can see when we click the links, the page is refreshing, and that's probably not what we want. So we can replace these links with the Next.js link component. So let's do that next. I'll go to the layout and replace these A elements with the Next.js links. Like this, let's save it, switch to the browser, and now if I click the posts, I can see the page is not refreshing and only the content down here is refreshed. So this navbar is coming from the layout, and when we switch between the pages, even though the URL over here changes, this part here won't re-render because it's defined in the layout, and over here the children is changing. So based on the route, we are rendering either the home page over here or the posts page over here. And one new thing with the app folder is that we no longer need separate components folder, but we can add the components that we need inside of the app folder right where we need them. So for example, we could move this navbar to its own component and just use it inside of this layout.js. So let's do that. So I'll add navbar and let's import it. So import navbar from, and I will add it to the same folder. So let's import it from there, like this. Then let's create the file or the component, just like this, and then export the function, and then paste in the navbar, and let's save it. And we still need to import the link, like this, so let's save it. And we import it in the layout. We can get rid of that, save it, and switch to the browser and refresh the page, and looks like our page is working. So as said, we can place the components that we need inside the app folder too. So next, let's see how we can display some posts in the posts page. So over here, we want to download some posts from an API and display the titles for those. So let's start by adding a function that loads the posts. And for this, I will use a dummy API that returns just some random posts. And I will call that API with fetch, like this. And then I will return post.json, like this. And now comes the interesting part, because normally in this situation, we would use something like get server-side props or get static props. But with Next.js 13 and the latest React version, we can now import something called use from React. So let's do that, like this. And if you have heard about React Suspense, well, this use over here, as far as I understood it, is exactly that. So we can use this to fetch our data inside of our component. So how that works is, let's go to our component and let's define a variable called posts, and then call the use and give the get posts function as a parameter, just like this. And let's log this like this, save it, and switch to the browser and go to the posts page. Let's actually open the console first. So let's open the post page. And in the browser console, we can't see anything. But if we switch back to the VS Code, we can see that right here we have some posts logged So looks like the request is working. But one thing you might be wondering is that why is this console log showing inside of the server's terminal or server console instead of the browser console over here? And the answer for that is that this component is now running as a server component. And inside of the app folder, all components are by default server components. So this right here also is a server component, and that's why it's logging the results inside of the server console. So now that we get our posts, let's just loop through them and display the titles like this. So I will just display them as a list. And one thing I added was curly braces over here because it looked like the posts were coming as a post variable from the API. But let's save this and switch to the browser. And inside of the posts page, we can see we have 3 post titles over here as expected. So if we go to the home, we see the home page, and inside the posts, we see the post titles. One thing we should add over here is a loading indicator. And with this new app folder structure, we can do it pretty easily. So let's switch to the VS Code, and inside of the app folder, I will create a new file called loading. And inside of here, I just return a function. And from that function, I will just return text loading like this. So let's save this and go to the browser. Let's refresh the page. So now we are at the home page. And now when we click the posts page, it will trigger the API request and load the posts. And that will take a little time, so we should see a loading indicator over here. So let's try it out. As you can see, it displayed the component that we defined inside of the loading.js. So this is all thanks to this new app folder structure, plus the new feature use from React. So this use automatically lets the other components know that, hey, we are loading data, so we can that way display the loading indicator. At least that's how I understood it, and that's how it seems to be working. So if I'm wrong, please do correct me in the comments, but as far as I know, that's how it works. So that easily we could add a loading indicator over there. Next, let's try to do it so that when we click one of these titles, it will display that post's details. So it will load that post from the API and display the details for that. In order to do that, let's add a link component over here like this. So what I did was add a Next.js link component, and the href is /posts/ the post ID, and I'm missing P from there like this. So we will use the post ID to identify which post we want to load. So let's save this and switch to the browser. And inside of here, let's refresh the page. And now if we click one of the blog posts, we get 404, but the URL points to the posts / the posts ID. So that's good. So next, let's create this page over here. So in order to do that, we need to add a new folder. And because we are using dynamic routes right now, we want to name this folder like this. And inside of that folder, we will create a new file called page.js. And inside of the page, we will again return a function. And inside of this page, we can catch the ID from the page params. So let ID equals params.id like this. And let's just for now return a div displaying that ID like this. So our page is ready. Let's switch to the browser. And right here we can see it displays the number over here. And if we click some other post, it will display that post's ID over here. Great. But what we actually want is to display that post under these titles. So let's hop to the code, and in order to accomplish that, we now need to define a new layout. So inside of this posts folder, we want to define a layout that has these titles and then has the blog post details displaying under here. So what we can do is actually just take this page.js inside of the posts folder and rename it as layout. And I will rename it over here also. And every layout gets the children as props. And it should also render those children. So let's add it over here, like this. So now if we save it, switch to the browser, we get 404 for the posts page. And that's actually because right now we only have the layout file inside of the posts folder. So what we still need is a page file inside of the posts folder. So let's add that and export a component from it like this. Let's save it. And now if I switch to the browser, we get the select a post text that we defined in the page.js. And now if we click one of these titles, it will display that ID under here. So our layout over here is now working, and the only thing left to do is to actually display the blog post details inside of the ID and page.js, so over here. So let's do that next. And we can do it the same way we did it earlier by importing the use from React and then defining the function that fetches the data from the API and the API URL. So it's the dummy.json.com/post/ then the ID of that post that we want to get the data for. So then just return post.json like this. And inside of here, we can define the post variable and then use the use and pass in the get post and the ID as a parameter like this. And let's modify the return statement to display the title and body of that blog post like this. Then I'll save it, switch to the browser. Let's see what happens. So we are getting an error and looks like we are missing S from the URL. So I think that was it. So let's save it, switch to the browser, and yeah, now it's working. So if we go to the home page and then to the posts page, we get the text, select the post, and when we select one, it will load that post's data under here, and we can see different posts in there too, like this. So right here also, this top part over here is using that layout that we defined, and only this part over here is changing. So it makes it much more user-friendly this way, and also more performant because we don't have to render and load all the other stuff also that has not been changed. In this video, we will learn about data fetching in Next.js 13, and we will also take a look on suspense boundaries and how you can use those to enable granular loading of your UI. So let's dive in. So over here, I have a fresh Next.js project open, and let's start by getting rid of the pages folder because we won't need that. And then let's create a page inside of an app folder. And from there, let's just export a function like this. And let's try to start the server. And by the way, if you didn't already watch the video I made about the app folder, explaining how it works and how the routing in the new app folder works, I'll leave a link in the description so you can check that out. But yeah, let's start the dev server. Okay, we are getting an error, and it's saying that we need to enable the experimental app folder because it's at the time still experimental. So let's do that. We just add to the Next.js config this experimental property. Now let's try to start the server again and then switch to the browser and try to open up the page. Okay, great. So we get the hello text, so everything is working. And for this application, I was thinking that let's create this kind of small dashboard that shows some user data and some companies data. So that way we can demonstrate how to fetch data and also how to use the Suspense features. So let's start by going back to the VS Code. And as we can see here, Next.js created for us this root layout file. So here I'll just add a header over here saying that dashboard like this. And yeah, it appears over there. Great. Then let's go to the page.js and define the users and companies sections in here. So let me do that. Okay, so here I added some code. So I made two columns. That first one displays the users and the second one displays the companies over here. So let's save it and see how it looks. So this is kind of our dashboard view. So on the left we have the users and companies on the right. Now, as we can see, we are just inserting some static data over here in the code. So what we actually want to do is fetch the users from an API and then fetch the companies from an API. And before we do any fetching, you can probably tell that these could be their own components. So let's add a users component and companies component. And thanks to the new app folder structure, we don't have to create any components directory and put them in there, but we can just add the components straight into the app folder and use them from there. So let's start by adding the users component. And inside here, I just export a function. And let's paste in the code we created. So from here, like this, and then inside of the page, let's import that component and then use it like this. And let's save it and see how it looks. So nothing changed, everything is still working, great. Let's do the same for the companies. So I add a new file to the app folder called companies, then export a function, and then copy the code from the page, so over here, and paste it in. And then in the page, I import the component, and let's display it. Save it and check the browser. Looks like everything is working great. So now we can start working on the data fetching. And where are we going to fetch the data? Well, I have an API running on localhost, which one endpoint returns some users data, and then another endpoint returns some companies data over here. So let's start with the users. So I'll open the users component over here, and with Next.js 13, we can actually just define the fetching logic right here in the component, which is great in my opinion, because it's right there where you need it and you don't have to hide it or bury it in some other functions or some other files. So it's as easy as just defining a new function up here. And then inside of here, we can use fetch to fetch the data. So let's do that. And the URL, let's copy that. So it was there and paste it in. And then, let's add a wait like that. And then just return the rest.json like this. Then inside of the component up here, we can call that function. So let's do that. And let's add a chunk over here. Great. And now inside of this list, let's loop those users and display some data like this. So we are just adding a list element for each user. Save it and let's switch to the browser and go to our web page, and looks like users map is not a function, but let's refresh the page and we still get the error. So let's see what's happening over here. I made a mistake because the users are coming in a variable called users. So let's do this over here. So in the API, we can see it returns an object with users over there. So let's try this now. So save it and switch to the browser, refresh the page. And yeah, what do you know? There we have some user data displayed. So let's do the same for companies. So inside of the companies component, at the top, I will define that getData function. And inside of the function, I will use fetch to call the API and then return the JSON like this. And then inside of the component, I will call that function and let's add the async. And then let's map through those companies and show some data like this. And we need to add this one over here too, like this. So let's save it and then switch to the browser. So now we have the dashboard and on it we have the users on the left and some companies on the right. That's great. So that's how easy it is to do data fetching with Next.js 13. So we just need to add the fetching function up here and then call it inside of the component. Let's take a look on how we can make this even more user friendly. So what I will do is actually stop my dev server and go to the browser, refresh the page so we see the site can't reach page, and then fire up my server again and then refresh the page. So now, and you can see it takes a little bit of time before it displays the page. And that is because the company's endpoint actually takes 2 seconds to load the company data and then return it. So the application is waiting the API for 2 seconds before it gets the data from the API. And for the user's endpoint, it takes roughly 1 second to return the data. So the application is not rendering anything before it gets all of this data. And one thing we can do is add a loading indicator in our application. So if we add a new file to the app folder called loading and export a component out of it like this, and then if we again stop the dev server, switch to the browser, refresh it, and then start the dev server and try to refresh the page. So take a look what happens. So the server is running, then to the browser, refresh the page. As you can see, it actually shows the dashboard heading and then the text loading. And once the loading is done, it will display the users and companies. So this is much better already. And how this works is that if we take a look on our layout over here, so Next.js will right away serve this layout and the heading from it. But then as a children, we have the page, which has some loading to do inside of those components. So by adding the loading component inside of the app folder, we can show a custom loading indicator while these components are being rendered or while the data is being loaded. So that's one new feature of the Next.js 13, that we can add these special files called loading. There are a bunch of others also. You can check the documentation for those. So there is, I think, also error and template and maybe some other, but at least the loading is for the loading indicator. So Next.js 13 detects that, okay, this component is still loading, so let's show the loading indicator. This is good, but we can make this even better, because if the users take only like 1 second to load and then companies take 2 seconds to load, wouldn't it be better to show the users as soon as they are loaded and then the companies as soon as they are loaded? Well, yeah. So let's do that next. And how we can do this is with suspense boundaries. So let's go to our page.js, and I will start by importing suspense from React like this. And then I will use it. And the suspense takes a prop called fallback, which is a component that will be displayed while data is loading. You will see it in a second. So for this, I will just add a div saying loading users like this. And then I will move these users inside of here like this. Then I will do the same for the companies like this. So let's save it and see what happens. So we are on the dashboard, and now if I refresh the page, you can see it first displays loading users, loading companies, and as soon as the users are loaded, so the API returns the data, it will render the users list while the companies list is still loading. So let's try that again. So I will refresh the page. So it shows the loading users and then loading companies. So this way, user right away sees the dashboard and some loading indicators that data is loading. And then when any part of that data is fetched, it will automatically be displayed right away rather than waiting all the other requests to also complete before rendering the page. So let's try out changing these users out of that suspense call. So now the users is not inside of the suspense boundaries. I'll save this and let's try to refresh the page. And as you can see, it first shows the page's loading text that came from the loading indicator we defined here. And after the users are fetched, then it will display the users but still be loading the companies because the companies was inside of a suspense boundary. But let's move these users back inside of that suspense boundary and save it and refresh the page. So you can see it displays the both loading indicators right away, and when the users are fetched, displays them, and when the companies are fetched, displays them. So this is how you use the suspense boundaries inside of a Next.js 13 application. I hope this video was helpful, and please let me know in the comments what you think of this and if this video was helpful. And also, if you are not already, please hit the subscribe button below too. Today I want to show you how to generate OG images from HTML and CSS with Next.js. We will use the new Vercel OG npm package to do this. But why would you want to generate images, or why should you be excited about this? Well, that's a very good question. And the answer is that with this package you can automatically and dynamically generate your OG social card images for your pages without any extra work. And we all know that it's super important for SEO and for those social shares of your pages to have those OG images in place. So let's dive into the documentation and take a look on a couple of examples real quick. Here I have opened the OG image generation documentation page. And right up here, they list some of the benefits of using this. And first one is performance. So the generation actually happens on the edge. And the API routes that do the generation and use this package are run as edge functions. So that makes them super fast. And the next one is ease of use. So we can define the images using HTML and CSS as mentioned, and the library will automatically and dynamically generate images from that markup. And third one, we have the cost effectiveness. So this package actually automatically adds the correct headers to cache the computed images at the edge. So if we have generated an image earlier, it will use the cached version instead of generating it again. So this is great. About the supported features, they support basic CSS layouts, custom fonts, text wrapping, centering, nested images. That's great. And they are compatible with any framework and application deployed on Vercel. Let's look at the usage requirements. So we need Node.js 16 or newer to use this. But note that only Edge runtime is supported. So the default Node.js runtime is not supported, and we need to use the experimental Edge runtime. So let's remember that. But let's get started. I think they have a code snippet over here. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is let's actually open up VS Code and copy this one from here and paste it in to our own application and go from there. So here I have empty Next.js project open, just freshly generated. I will create a new file in the API folder called og1.jsx, and inside of here I will paste the code from the docs. And let's save it. So let's take a look on what happens in here. So first we import the image response from the library. Then we need to define the Edge runtime with the config runtime experimental edge. And note that this is a new feature in the latest Next.js version, that you can run your API routes as edge functions also. So you just have to pass in that runtime experimental edge config. But that feature is coming from there, and it's, as the name suggests, is still experimental. But next, as with any API route, we want to export a function, and inside of that function, we return that image response. We import it here, and looks like that as a first parameter, it gets the HTML that we want to have in the image, and then the image width and height as a second parameter. And right here, we have some basic styling and then just the text hello world. So let's save this, open up the console, and I almost forgot. So first we of course need to install that OG package. So let's do that. Great, it's installed. Then I will start my dev server and go to the localhost. And the API route we had was /API/OG1 like this. So I'll open that up, and looks like we get an empty image. And now that I refresh the page, it actually displayed the text. So there was something going on. But yeah, this is image from that HTML that we defined. That's pretty cool. So let's test it out. I'll modify it a little bit. I'll add a couple of more exclamation marks and save it, and go to the page and refresh it. And what do you know? It updates the picture. So looks like it's working. So this is like the hello world example. So let's try to add some dynamic functionality over here. So what if we could pass in this text as a parameter for this API route? This way we could create a dynamic image every time we call this. So let's do that. I'll start by adding the request variable as a parameter. Then I want to get the search parameters from that request. So let's do that. And then I want to get the text parameter from those search params. So const text equals and search params get and text like this. And then let's use that variable inside the div right here, like so. So I'll save this, switch back to the browser, and now as a parameter, I pass in the text, and let's say hello there, and press enter, and looks like it's working. So it generates the image from that text. Let's see what else we can do with this. So this was the default example, but I think there was other examples also. Yeah, so down here we have a bunch of examples that we can take a look, but let's take a look on the dynamic external image. So we can actually get an external image to our image. So I think they had the GitHub example right here. Yeah, so I'll copy this again and switch to the VS Code, create a new API route called OG2JSX, paste in the code, and let's see what's happening in here. It looks like this was TypeScript code, so I'll just remove that and we should be good to go. So first again, the image response over here, then defining the experimental edge, and then we again export a function where we first get the username search param from the URL, then do some null checking for it and return a default image if the username is not provided. Then again, from this API route, we return that image response, and here we have the HTML for the image. So it's a div with some styles over here, and then inside of the div we have an image, and as a source parameter we are referencing to GitHub, so fetching a GitHub image or GitHub avatar for the username. And if you didn't know, you can actually get anyone's GitHub avatar like this. So if you go to the github.com/ then the username, for example me.png, so that automatically gives you the avatar for that username. So that's what we are setting the source for the image over here. and then just displaying a text with also the username like this. So that's all that happens here. So let's save it, go to the browser, and I'll go to the correct URL. So it was the OG2. So let's first try it without the username, and we get this default image guiding us. So let's add the username like this, and let's try mine. And what do you know? It generated the image with my avatar and the GitHub URL. Let's try something else. So for example, Vercel works, Netlify, that works. Yeah. And like, I know it's localhost, but even though it works super fast, I think. So that's how to add an external image to your OCE image or generated image. And let's see, there was still some other examples over here. So we can use dynamic title, that we did, and the external image we did. But then also you can use emojis, SVGs, custom fonts, and also Tailwind, which is interesting. So this is still in the experimental mode, but basically you can use Tailwind styles to define your image over here, and it works out of the box. So yeah, that's definitely something I'm gonna be testing out. Overall, I think this is very interesting package to use. And what I'm most excited about is that with the help of this Vercel OG library, I can now add automatically dynamic OG images for my blog posts without any extra work. Because for me, making the images when publishing a blog post is always the most tiresome thing to do and frustrating. And if I can automate that phase with this, I am one happy camper. Let me know in the comments what are your thoughts about this. I would love to hear it. And also, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button below. I would highly appreciate it. In this video, we will take a look on server and client components in Next.js 13. I'll right away at the beginning show briefly the documentation of them and point out a few things from there, but if you have already read that and just want to see the coding part, then you can jump ahead. I'll leave chapter markers down below. But let's get started. So here is the documentation for server and client components. And probably the number one thing that you need to know is said right here. So by default, all components inside the new app directory are React server components. So this allows us to automatically adopt the server components with no extra work. And some of the benefits of using server components are said right here. So we can better leverage the server infrastructure. For example, large dependencies that previously would impact the JavaScript bundle size that is sent to the client side remains now entirely on the server. So the amount of JavaScript sent to the client is reduced, which is good. However, we can't work entirely without JavaScript, so the app directory still needs some JavaScript. And when a route is loaded, the Next.js and React runtimes will be loaded, and those are cacheable and predictable in size. And this runtime does not increase in size as our application grows. And whenever we need some additional JavaScript on the client side, for example, some click events or that kind of stuff, then we would need to use the client components. So the server components are completely rendered on the server. And then the client components are, surprise, surprise, rendered on the client. And with Next.js, the client components can also be pre-rendered on the server and then hydrated on the client. If pre-rendering and hydration are something that you are new to, no worries, I have a video explaining both of those, so I'll leave a link for that in the description and you can check it out. So basically all of our components inside of the app directory are rendered as server components, unless we add a keyword use client on top of the component code. So we can use client components by adding this use client statement at the top of the component file. And that's all we need to do in order to render a component as a client component. So when should we then use server components and when client components? Well, first of all, if you are trying to use some features or APIs that are only usable in client components, Next.js will throw an error. So that's one way to know it. But right here we have a nice table explaining some of the things that you should do with server and client components. So with server components, whenever you are fetching data, you should use server components. There are exceptions. You can also fetch data with client components if you really need to, but it's recommended to fetch the data in the server component. Then, of course, if we access some backend resources or if we have some sensitive information, for example, tokens or API keys, those should be kept in server components. And then also it's recommended to keep large dependencies on the server, which reduce the client-side JavaScript. On the other hand, if we want to add some interactivity, for example, with click handlers or on-change handlers, or if we want to use state or lifecycle effects or browser-only APIs, or some custom hooks that depend on state effects or browser-only APIs, then we should use the client components. And also if you are using React class components, then you need to use the client components also. But I think that's enough for us to get started with the client and server components, and we can jump into the VS Code. So let's create a simple application that demonstrates the difference between server components and client components. And I have here a fresh Next.js application using Next.js 13 open. And what I'm going to do first is get rid of the pages folder and create a new folder app. And inside of that, I'll create page.js. And over here, I will export a function like this and save it. And then let's fire up our dev server. And we need to add the experimental app dir true statement to the Next.js config. So let's do that like this. And then try to run our dev server again. And switch to the browser and see how it looks. Okay, we get the hello text, so everything is good. Now let's hop into the page.js. Let me make this a little bit smaller, like this. So let's create an application that fetches blog posts from an API and then just shows them in a list. And I should say that for this we are just going to use a dummy JSON API to get the posts and then display them. So let's get started by actually adding a heading over here. And then I will add a posts component right here that will handle the data fetching and displaying the blog posts. And since we don't yet have this, I will import it over here like this and then create that component. So new file posts.js. And then I will export a function from here like this. And let's save it and see that it works. Looking good. Next, let's fetch the data. So up here, I will define a function that fetches the data like this. So we are just going to fetch the posts from this placeholder API. So if we navigate to this URL with the browser, we can see it returns a bunch of blog posts as a JSON. So next, let's call that function inside of the posts component and then render the posts like this. So we are calling the function over here, getting the posts and then mapping through them and just rendering the title. So let's switch to the browser and see how it looks. So it looks like we are getting a bunch of these titles from the API. So let's say we wanted to show the title and the body of a blog post. And let's actually create a new component called post that will display those. So I will create a new file over here called post.js and then export a function from here that displays that data. Like this. So we are getting the title, body and ID as a data prop and then just displaying the title and body over here. So let's go to the posts.js and import that component like this and then use it instead of the div. Like this. Let's save it and see if it works. Looks like it, so we get the title over here and then the body over here. and we have a bunch of blog posts, so that's great. So at this point, I just want to point out that this post component right now is a server component. And actually all of these components we have are server components. And that's because they are in the app folder and they are not using the use client statement. So the post component is also a server component, and this data fetching that we do over here is done on the server, and then the client just gets this component with the data already rendered. So no data fetching to this JSON placeholder API is done in the client side. And we can actually test this. So we have the network tab open over here. So I will clear that, and we can actually also change to the fetch tab. And now if we refresh the page, we can see that no fetch request was made to that JSON placeholder API. So all that is done in the server. But how about if we wanted to add a like button over here for each of these posts? So let's take a look how to do that. So first of all, I will create a new component for that. So new file and like button, and then just export a function from it like this. And then let's use it in the post component. So let's import that like this, and then let's render it under the body, like so. Now let's save this and switch to the browser. I will refresh the page, and looks like it's loading quite a bit. This actually happened to me a couple of times. I'm not sure what this is about, but what helps here is just to close the server and then boot it up again. I don't know if this is something to do with the app dev still being in beta or something like that. I don't know, but that at least helped last time, and what do you know, it helps now. So yeah, we have the like button over here now. So right now the like button is a server component, but let's actually make our like button a real button and add some functionality to it. So let me just make a couple of modifications like this. So I added a button with on-click handler just throwing an alert saying that you like this. So let's save it and go to the browser. And right now we can see that we have an error over here saying that event handlers cannot be passed to client component props. So what this means is that in order for us to use this click handler, we need to convert this like button to a client component. And how we can do that? Well, all we have to do is add that use client statement up here, like this. Let's save it and go to the browser. And now we have a like button over here and no error anymore. And if we click the like button, we get the alert saying that you like this, like this. So as we read in the docs, if we want to add some on-change stuff, we need to use a client component. And also if we wanted to use some use state or use effect hooks, for example, then we would also need to use a client component. So let's say we wanted to change the button text based on user clicking on it. So for that, we would need use state. So let me add some code over here and let's go through it together. So like this, first I imported the use state from React and then added isLiked state for the component, and then when the user clicks the button, it toggles the isLiked variable, and based on that it will display either unlike or like. So let's save it and check the browser. So now we have the like button over here, and if we click it, it will change the text to unlike. So using the use state also requires us to use client component. So this component over here uses client components, so it's rendered on the client side. Whereas the post component over here is rendered on the server side. So this title and body are already rendered in the server, and then this component is sent to the client. But the like button itself is rendered in the client side because we use the use client statement at the top of the file. Hopefully this clears things up for you regarding the client and server components. I know this is just a short, simple example, but I still felt that I should make this video just explaining the basics. In this video, we will take a look on how to add authentication to your Next.js 13 application using NextAuth. We won't go into details on how NextAuth works, but we will rather see how to use the authentication inside the new app folder that came with Next.js 13. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Okay, so here I have a Next.js 13 application open that I already did some work on, and what I did was actually just this getting started portion of the NextAuth. So I created a new project with create next app, then I added the NextAuth package to it, then I created this NextAuth API route and then modified the app.js to correspond to this one over here. And next I created this login button component with this code over here. So let's take a look on this in the VS Code. So first of all, here is the app.js. It has the session provider wrapping the component, and inside of the index we are displaying a heading and then the login button, and here is the login button. So right here it's basically the same code as it was in the documentation. Only difference is that we are also rendering this user information component that gets the session user as a prop, and what that does is it only just displays the user data as JSON. And last, we have the API route, so the /API/auth/NextAuth, and this is the same code that was in the documentation up here, I think, yeah, over here. So basically I just followed this getting started section of the NextAuth documentation. I'll leave a GitHub link to the description so you can check out this code, and I'm thinking of creating just a new branch for this starting position, so you can check out this if you want to follow along. So let's just quickly see how the application looks. So I will start the server and switch to the browser like this. So we have the heading and then the login button saying that we are not signed in, and when we click sign in we will be prompted with sign in with GitHub, and when we click that we can sign into the application and we see our information down here, and then we can sign out from the sign out button over here. So sign in with GitHub, and it will display our information over here. So as you can see, this is very basic example, and I wanted to keep it that way because my thought was that I want to see how I can convert this application using the pages folder and the authentication in there, how I can convert that to using the Next.js 13 app folder and the server and client components. So that will be the focus of this video. So we will basically now take this application and convert it to use the app folder. So let's get started by first adding the app folder over here. And then let's add a new file called page inside of it. And from here I will export a function like this. And then I will add to the Next.js config the appdir experimental property like this. And this is just because at the moment the appdir is still experimental, so we need to define it in the Next.js conf. Then let's try to run this. So yarn dev, and looks like we are getting an error about the index and page.js conflicting. So let me just rename this index real quick like this, and then restart the server and check the browser. Okay, we get the text from the page.js file over here. So we are now using this page.js. So next, let's just copy paste everything from the index.js to the page.js like this. And I'll just rename this to page. And now we can see we are importing the login button. So let's actually move the login button to the app folder from the components folder. I'm just gonna drag and drop it over there and update the imports over here. And let me just in case restart the server and open up the browser. And now we are seeing a lot of red over here, but yeah, we are getting an error saying that React context is unavailable in server components. So what's happening in here is that now that we are using the login button component inside of the app dir, it is by default rendered as a server component. And if we take a look on the login button component, we can see that we are using click handlers and the session over here and all that kind of stuff that goes with client components. So let's just first define that, hey, this is client component, and we can do that by adding the use client at the top of the file like this. So now let's save it and see what happens. Okay, we get another error saying that use session must be wrapped inside of a session provider. So if you remember, we used inside of the app.js this session provider. So now we need to add it also to our app folder. So the best place for that is inside of the layout or the root layout. And we could add it over here. So wrap this whole thing inside of a session provider or just the children or that kind of stuff. But a better way, I think, is to actually define a new component called providers that will then have all the providers that we need, and it will wrap the children inside of those providers. So that sounded very complicated, but let me show you how to do it. So let's add a new file in the app folder called providers. And this now will be a client component. So I will add the use client, and then I will import the session provider from NextAuth like this. And then I will export a function, and I will get the children from the props. And then inside of the function, we will return the children wrapped by the session provider. So like this. And looks like I have a typo over there, like that. Okay, so now what this component does is it adds the session provider around the children that are passed for this component. So now we can, in the layout, import that providers, and then we can use it over here in the body, like this, and then just move the children inside of that providers tag, like this. Of course, we could wrap everything inside of the return statement, inside of the providers, but we really don't need to, and it's not a good practice to do it like that. So we will just wrap the children inside of the providers, and that should do it. And one thing I want to mention also is that if you have more providers or some context stuff, you can just add them inside of this providers file and wrap this inside of them. So that way you can have all your providers inside of this file, and the layout file will look just like this. So now let's save this and check out the browser. And let me refresh the page, and looks like it's working. So we are getting the same information we got with the previous version. So it's our login information or the user information. And now if we sign out, we are signed out. Let me refresh the page. And now if we click the sign in, we are prompted with sign in with GitHub. So let's click that. And the login seems to be working. One thing we actually forgot to do was inside of the login button to move this user information inside of the app folder too. So let's do that. So I'm gonna drag it and move and update the imports like this. And let's save the login button and switch to the browser. I'll refresh the page, and it looks like everything is working. So this is a bit weird, because if we take a look on the user information component, so now that it's inside of the app folder, it should be rendered as a server component by default. And as we can see, we have no use client statement inside of it, and we are not using any state or click handlers or that kind of stuff. So I would assume that it's a server component right now. And we can test this by adding a console log over here, saying that hello from user information, and let's save that. So now if this is run on server, we should get the console log down here, but if it's run as a client component, it should be displayed in the JavaScript console of the browser. So let me just switch to the browser, refresh the page, and looks like it is displayed in the JavaScript console down here. And this is a bit surprising for me. So the only thing I can think of is that because we are rendering it inside of the client component, this component will also be rendered as a client component. So basically, the user information component can be rendered as a server component, but if it is rendered inside of a client component, then it will also be rendered as client component. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. And if we wanted to render a server component inside of the client component, we can do this with the children prop. So let's see how that is done. So first of all, I will just add a new component here that I will use as a server component. I will call it app description. And let me just add some code inside of here like this. So we are just exporting a function with the text that this is the application description and it's a server component. So now how we can render this with our client component? Well, let's switch to the page.js and modify this login button rendering. So I will add like this. And then we can pass in this component as a children for this login button. So let's first actually import it like this, and then we can just pass it in over here like so. And let's save this. And inside of the login button, we can now render this with the children. So let's say we want to render it under the sign out button. So let's add it over there like so. And I need to still define the children or get the children from the props like this. And looks like I made a typo again. Okay, now let's save it and show it in the browser. So we can see it is displayed under the sign out button. So let's log something inside of this component like this. And now if I go to the browser, I refresh the page, we are only getting the hello from user information in the browser console. And now in the server console, we are getting the hello from app description.js. So this component now is rendered as a server component because we used it with the children inside of a client component. Okay, but next you might ask that, okay, can we use this session data inside of a server component like the app description, for example? The answer is yes, we can, but it's still in beta and very unstable. So NextAuth provides this unstable get server session function. And as they say in here, this feature is still experimental and it might be removed or changed in the future. So I would keep that in mind when using this. But let's see how this function can be used inside of a server component. So I'll switch back to the VS Code and let me add a couple of lines of code inside of our app description.js component, and then let's go through it together. Okay, so what I did here was I imported the unstable get server session function from NextAuth, and then I get the session inside of the component with that function like this. And then we are just rendering the username under the text div over here. So let's save this and see if it works. So let me refresh the page and yeah, looks like it's working. So we are getting our name under the text down here. So this is pretty cool. And again, we are not getting any logs from the app description.js inside of our browser console, but we are getting them inside of the server console. So that just verifies that the component is rendered in the server or as a server component. So now that we have the session data available inside of our server component, what we could do is use the user information component to display that data. So let's do that next. So first I'll import the user information component, and then instead of this username, I will just render the user information, pass in as a data the session.user like this. And let's save it and actually go into the login button and let's comment out the user information from there. So we are not rendering it inside of the login button anymore, and we are just rendering it inside of the app description. So let's save it and switch to the browser. And let me refresh the page. And now looks like that the user information is displayed under the text inside of the app description component. And what we can see also is that there is no console logs in our browser console. And if we check the server console, we can see that we have a hello from app description as expected, but then also we have a console log from the user information component. So now that we are using the user information inside of the server component, that is the app description, the user information component is also rendered as a server component. So just to recap on what we did in here. So let's open the layout, the root layout. So first, what we want to do is wrap the children with the providers component, and the providers component had the session provider from the NextAuth. And it basically just wraps the children inside of it. So that's the number one thing we need to do when adding the authentication for our application. And then if we take a look at the page.js, in here we have the login button, and that is a client component, and we are getting the session information in here with the use session hook from the NextAuth. And then based on that, display sign in or sign out buttons. So if you are using client components in your application, this is the way you can get the user information inside of the component. And then if you are using a server component like we did with the app description, you can get the session information with that unstable get server session function. But again, I just want to remind that it's still unstable, so there might be changes or it can even be removed. So just keep that in mind when using it. So with that function, we get the same session information inside of a server component, and we can use it over there. And if we still take a look on the page.js, so what we learned also is that if you are rendering a server component inside of a client component, it will be rendered as client component. So if you want to render a server component as a server component inside of a client component, you need to pass it for the client component as children, as we did in here. So the app description is a server component, and we passed it in as a children for the client component login button, and that way we were able to render the app description component as a server component. So I think that's something you need to keep in mind, because what I was thinking at first is that if I just wrap the children with the providers and then put my components in there and all that stuff, you might end up pretty easily using just client components. So I think that's really something that we need to think through when creating the hierarchy for the application and how we are using the components in the component tree, because otherwise we can just end up using client components and we get none of the benefits that come with server components. Hopefully you found this video at least a little bit helpful, and it helped you at least a little to understand how to use the authentication inside of the Next.js 13 app directory. And if it did, please do leave a like and hit the subscribe button too if you are not already subscribed. In today's video, we will learn how to protect your Next.js API routes using NextAuth. So let's dive right in. First, let's start by creating a new Next.js application. Okay, let's open it up with VS Code. And let's just fire up the dev server to see that everything is working. I'll type in yarn dev and open the localhost 3000. And we get the default Next.js application. Great. So the plan now is to add the NextAuth to this application and then add a login button that we can use to log in and log out, and then create one API route that is protected, meaning that you can't access it without logging in. So let's start by getting rid of all this boilerplate code. So I'll open the index.js file, and from the render method I will just remove everything like this, and we don't need those imports anymore, like this. And then I will just for now print hello over here. Let's see. Okay, it's working. And next, as I mentioned, we will use NextAuth for the authentication. So let's open up the NextAuth web page, and I will just go over here to the get started section and copy this install command. So we will use yarn to add the NextAuth package. So I will stop the server and paste in the command like that. And next, let's see the get started page. So what we want to do next is create this nextauth.js file, which will handle the authentication. So what I'm going to do is just copy this code over here, and looks like we need to create a folder called auth into the API folder and then place this inside of that. So let's do that next. So inside the API folder, I will create a new folder called auth, and inside of that I will create that auth file. Then I'll paste in the code that we copied, and let's take a closer look on this file. So we are importing this GitHub provider and then passing in client ID and client secret. So what this means is that we will use GitHub for authentication or logging in. So we will use our GitHub credentials to log in, and that's totally fine for this. We could use some other ones also. They have these adapters for Twitter, Facebook, and a bunch of others. But for now, let's just use the GitHub provider. So next, what we need to do is to create a GitHub application that we will use for the authentication. So right here you can see that we are getting these GitHub secret and GitHub ID from the environment variables. So in order to get those, let's go to GitHub, and you can go to the developer settings. So just going to this URL /settings/apps, and then go to the OAuth apps. And you can see I already have one, but let's create a brand new for this application. And let's give it a name like this. And then for the homepage URL, we can just type in the localhost 3000 for now. And then this authorization callback URL for GitHub, we want to put localhost 3000 /API/auth/callback/GitHub. And that should be it. Let's register the application. So now we get all this information. So right here, we can see the client ID, which is this one over here. And then the client secret can be generated over here. So let's do that. So over here is the secret for our application. So let's now take these two values and put them into our application so we can use them. So switch back to the VS Code, and you can see that we get these from this process.env. Then the variable name. One way you could do this is to just put the ID and secret over here like this, but this is not good because this way the secrets will be committed together with your code, and that's something you don't want. So let's keep it like this, and in order to define these environment variables, we can create an environment file in our repository. So let's do that. I'll call it .env.local, and right away you can see it's grayed out, which means that it's in git ignore, so it won't be committed with the other files. So let's open that up, and inside of here, let's define those variables. So GitHub ID and then GitHub secret, like this. And go back to the GitHub and copy the ID and paste it in. And then for the secret, let's copy this one and paste it in like this. Let's save it. And I think our application should be ready, the GitHub application. So let's switch back to the NextAuth and everything should be fine in here also. So next step, let's go back to the NextAuth web page. So we created the NextAuth file. Next, we need to wrap our application inside of this session provider. So I will just copy everything from here also and open the pages app.jsx file. And I'll just remove everything and paste in the code we copied. So what we are doing here is getting the session provider from NextAuth and then just wrapping the application inside of this session provider and providing the session as a prop for that provider. And I know we are using the app.js file over here and not the Next.js 13 app folder. And that's just because this is simpler to set up. And if you want to set it up in Next.js 13 and the app folder, I have a video also about that, so be sure to check that out because it's also possible with the app folder, and if you want to use it, check out the video, it's all there. But for this example, we will use the app.js file just because it's faster and easier to set up right now. So now that we have wrapped our application inside the session provider, the one thing left to do is add the login button, and we get the example login button also in the get started section of NextAuth. So over here is an example login button. So I will just copy that and go to VS Code and create a new folder called components. And inside of that, I will create the login button component and paste in the code and save it. And now let's go to the pages and the index.js file and replace the hello text with the login button. And let's import it like this. And yeah, so now I think our application is all set up for logging in through GitHub. So let's try it out and fire up the dev server and open the localhost 3000. Let me just make this a bit bigger. So we are getting the not signed in text, which is coming from the login button over here because we are not signed in. So let's try to sign in. So when I click this, I get this sign in with GitHub, and this comes because we added the GitHub provider inside the NextAuth.js file. So if we would add more providers over here, they would appear then on this page. So for GitHub, we want to sign in with it. So let's click that. And now it's asking us that do we want to authorize the application we created, to use it to login or authorize. So yeah, authorize. And it redirects us to our localhost 3000 and it says that we are signed in. Okay, great. So the sign in is working. So next, let's actually create the API route and add the protection for it. So I'll go to the VS Code and I'll create new API route inside the API folder and let's call it protected like this. And just for now, I will copy the hello API route inside of it just to test it out that it's working like this. So let's switch to the browser and try to access that API route. Okay, looks like it's working. So we get the hello from protected text. So now what we want to do is actually log out. So let's sign out. And I will open up that API route to a different tab like this. And right now we can see that we get hello from protected text, so it's still working. Okay, so now let's add a check for the API route to see that the user is logged in, and if the user is not logged in, let's show a message that, hey, you need to log in. So I will switch to the VS Code, and I have the protected.js API route open. And let me add some code over here for the check, and then let's go through it together line by line. Okay, so right now what I did was, first of all, added two imports. One for the auth options, which comes from the NextAuth file we had over here. And we will use it later on in the code. And then I imported the unstable getServer session function from the NextAuth next. And then I changed the handler function to async because we are using asynchronous function, the getServer session function. And then on line 5, we are getting the user session. And how we are getting that is with the unstable getServer session function. And that takes the request, response, and the auth options that we imported as a parameter. And as the name suggests, this is still unstable, so there might be some bugs or something like that. But this is still the way that NextAuth recommends to do this in their web page. And then on line 7, we are simply checking that if the session was not found, then we are sending the response that, hey, you must log in. And if it was found, it won't go into this if clause, and it will go to the end over here and return the hello from protected text. So let's test it out. So right now we are not signed in. So let's try to open up the protected API route and refresh the page. And looks like we are getting the message, you must be logged in. And that's what we wanted. So let's try to actually sign in over here. Let's sign in. All right, then try to refresh the page. And looks like we are still getting the same text. And we are actually signed out. Is there something wrong? Okay, so we get this decryption error. And I think what this is all about. So we still need to define two more variables in our environment variables file. And those variables are NextAuth URL and NextAuth secret. So let me just add those like this. So for the URL, we are just putting the localhost 3000, which is our URL. And this NextAuth secret can be anything you want. So I just added a test over here. So let's save this and try it again. So I'll go and sign in. We are signed in. Now let's see the API route and refresh the page. Okay, so now we get the hello from protected text, and we are still signed in the other tab. Great. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to use the NextAuth with Next.js 13 app structure, that's totally possible, and I have this video over here showing how to do just that. I'm also planning on making more of these NextAuth videos, so if you would like to see those, please do let me know in the comments, and also don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you are not already. In this video, we will take a look on how you can define API routes in the Next.js 13 app directory. So just yesterday, the Next.js 13.2 version was released, and with it came these route handlers. And these route handlers are basically a replacement for the traditional API routes. We can read from the announcement that they support both Edge and Node.js runtimes and features like general purpose static rendering and revalidation. And the way we use these route handlers is by using this route.js or TS file. And we need to export a synchronous function from it named by the HTTP verb that we want to target. So get, post, put, delete, so on. And one thing to note is also that this route.js or TS file is a special file, and they are not available in the pages directory, as they are a replacement for the API routes, and they are only available under the app directory. But enough of talk, let's take a look how we can use these in action. So let's start by creating a fresh Next.js project, and I will do it with yarn create next app and then give it a name. So let's run this. All right, once it's run, let's open up this in VS Code. All right, so let's take a look on the folder structure in this project. So as you saw when running the create next app, I chose to use the app directory, so it created one for me over here. And as you can see, it didn't create a pages directory anymore, which it used to do before this. And actually, I tested this out like 6 hours ago, and it still generated the pages directory, but looks like they got rid of that now, and it's just using the app directory if you choose to use it when prompted when creating the project. So right here, we can right away open this app directory, and we can see that we have the API folder, and inside of that we have a hello folder, and there we have that route.js file. And if we open it up, we can see that we are exporting a synchronous function called get and returning a new response, hello Next.js. So let's just fire this up and test it out. So I will open up the terminal and fire up the dev server. And let's navigate to that localhost 3000. It looks like the front page is opening. So let's try to access that API route by going to the /API/ and I think it was hello, like this. And what do you know, we get the text hello Next.js. So we can see that this API route is working right now. So we are making a GET request to the hello API route, and we are getting the response back. But what if we wanted to make an API route and post something to it? So let's say we wanted to post something to this hello API route. So let's switch back to the VS Code, and inside the same route.js that is inside of the hello folder, we can actually just add a new function below the get function like this. So we are exporting a synchronous function, and we are using the post verb now because we want to catch the post request. And for now, let's just return some JSON so we can test it out and see that we are actually getting the post request to this API route. So I'm gonna just return response.json, and let's say message is hello from post route, like this. Let's save it. And now we can't do it with the browser because this is making a GET request. So what we want to do is actually make a POST request. So I'm going to open up my Postman. So if you're not familiar with Postman, this is a tool that you can use to make API requests. So right here, I'm going to make a new request, and I'm going to copy the address from the browser, paste it in, and then from here I will choose post because we want to make a post request, and that should be it. Let's hit the send button, and what do you know, we get the message hello from post route. And now if we change this up to get request, we can send it, and we get the response from the get function. One thing you should note though is that we are now making the request to /API/hello. And if you remember, with pages directory, we had to put the API routes inside of an API directory, and that way Next.js knew that, okay, these are API routes. But that's actually not the case with the route handlers, because we can define a route file inside of any folder inside of the app directory as long as there isn't a page.js file in it or page.ts file. So let's try that out by actually creating a new folder to this app directory, and I'm going to call it blog posts, and inside of that I will create a new file called route.js. So let's say we wanted to get some blog posts when we hit the localhost /blog posts like this. So for now it doesn't do anything, it says 405 because we haven't implemented the function yet. So let's do that. So export async function called get, because we want to target the get request method. And let's actually fetch some blog posts from another API and then return those. So I will define a variable and then use fetch to get some blog posts. And the API we are going to use for this example is the JSON placeholder API. So this is just an API that returns some dummy data that you can use when testing or developing. And we want the posts, so the address will be, let's open it up in the browser first. So it's JSON placeholder.typico.com/posts. So we can see it returns some fake blog posts for us. So let's copy that URL and paste it into the fetch like this. And then let's get the posts like this. And now we can return a response, and we want to return JSON, and let's return the posts like this. So let's try it out. I'll open up my Postman, and now let's try to make the API call to the /blog posts. And looks like we are getting the blog post data back to our Postman. So the get route is working for that. And as you can see, we can call different APIs inside of the route handlers and do a bunch of stuff inside of here before returning a response. And again, if we wanted to have another endpoint for this, so let's say we want to have the post endpoint also, all we have to do is define the post function. And then inside of here, we could do some logic for posting a blog post, for example, and then for our testing purposes, let's just return response and a message like this. So we can see that we can hit the post endpoint, and I switch to the Postman, change the get to post and make the request, and looks like it's returning the correct message. And if we wanted to do, for example, delete, again, export async function and delete, and then inside of here do any logic we want, and let's just test it out like this and test it out with Postman. So let's change the post to delete and make the request, and we get the correct message. So that's how you can use API routes in the Next.js 13 app folder by using the route handlers. And I just wanted to show you guys real quick on how to use them and how they work, because many of you have been asking me on how to use API routes in the app folder. And this is the answer, the route handlers. I didn't go very deep on all the other stuff we can do with the route handlers, but if that's something you would like to see, please let me know in the comments, and I will make that kind of video where we take a little deeper dive on what else you can do with them and how they work. Hopefully you still got something out of this video, and if you did, please leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you are not already. In today's video, we will take a little bit of a deep dive to Next.js route handlers. We will learn how to use cookies, headers, redirects, dynamic route segments, And also we will learn how to get the request body in a post request. This is one of the most asked questions that I have gotten lately, so hopefully this video will be helpful for you. Without further ado, let's get started. So right here I have my terminal open, and let's start by creating a new Next.js application. And remember to select the yes for this experimental app directory. Okay, then I will open this up in VS Code. Okay, and something I like to do first thing whenever I create a new project is just to try to run it and see that everything is working. So let's start the dev server and go to the localhost 3000. And looks like we get the default application and everything is working. Great. So let's start with how we can use cookies inside of the route handlers. And what I'm going to do is open up the app folder and the API folder, and then create a new folder inside of the API folder called cookies. And inside of that folder, we will create the route.js file. And let's add just a little bit of code to see that we can access this route like this. So we just defined the get function in here and then just return kind of hello world response. So let's test this out. So I will save this. And next I will open up my Postman, because we are going to be making get and post requests to these API routes. It's just easier to test them out and see how they work with Postman. And if you're not familiar with Postman, it's a program that enables you to do all kinds of API requests with different kinds of parameters. So let's start by creating a new request, and the address is localhost 3000/API/cookies. So let's type that in like this. And over here, we want to use the get method, and let's send it out and see what we get. So it looks like we get an internal server error. So let's check the console. Okay, so looks like we forgot the new keyword for the response. So let's add that, save it, and try it again. Okay, now we get the correct message over here. So we can access the API route. Next, let's modify the cookies that we are sending with this request. So in Postman, I will go to the headers tab, and let's add a cookie header over here. And let's add a cookie called token, and let's say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like this. So now this token cookie should be sent with the request whenever we are sending or clicking the send button. So now let's see how we can catch this cookie inside of our route handler. So inside the route.js, what I'm first going to do is import cookies from Next headers like this, and this enables us to access the cookies that we are getting with the request. Then inside the get function, we want to get a cookie store with that cookies function. So let's do that like this. And then if we want to get a cookie called token, all we have to do is define a variable and then call cookie store.get and give the name of the cookie we want to get like this. Now let's actually return this cookie in our response like this. Let's save it and go to the Postman and try to send this request. So we have in headers, we have the cookie header with the token 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we should get that as a response. So let's try it out. Okay, so we get your token is object. So one thing we forgot to do is call the value for this token, because this is an object with property value, and that value has the token value. So let's add over there token.value, and let's save it and switch to the Postman and try again. Okay, now we get the correct token. Your token is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is how we can get cookies from a request, but these are just read only. So if we want to modify the cookies, we need to return a new response with set cookie and then the cookie value we want to set it to. So let me just type it out and let's see it through together. Okay, so like this. So what I did here was add for this response an other parameter, which is an object. I added status 200, so the status will be 200. And also then in the headers property, we are saying that set cookie should be token equals then the token value, but then I added this modified text at the end of the token, so we can see if it actually works. So let me save this out and let's test it out. So I'll open my Postman, and inside here we have the cookie 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now if we send a new request, we can see that we got the correct text as expected. But then if we scroll up a little bit our headers, we can see that we got this cookie header up here, and the value for it is the cookie that we defined in the route handler. So that's how you can set cookies if you want, but if you just want to read them, you can use this cookie store to get all the cookies you want. Okay, so next let's see how to use headers with the route handlers. So again, I will create a new folder called headers, and inside of that folder I'll create the route.js file. And these headers work pretty much the same way as cookies does. So let me just type in the code and let's go it through together. Okay, so first we import headers from the next headers, then we define the get function, and inside of that, as we did with the cookies, we are getting a header list in this case by calling the headers function. And then from the headers we can get any header we want, and in this case let's get the host header. So if we check out the Postman, we can see that the host header is sent with the request. So let's get that and then just return it as a response over here. So let's test it out. I'll save this and open Postman. Let me create a new request. And the endpoint is /API/headers, like this. And yeah, let's see, we have the headers, and for the host header, it says it's calculated when a request is sent. So let's try it out. Let's send this, and looks like it returns the text. You made the request from localhost 3000, and that is our host, so that's correct. We could also get, for example, the user agent. Let's try it out. So I'm just gonna replace it here, and the text will be wrong, but that's okay, just to see that how it works. So let's send it, and looks like it gets the correct value for that header. Let me just make it back as host. Okay, so that's how you can get headers in the route handlers. And if we wanted to return the host header, for example, for the response, we can do it by adding a new parameter in the response. And let me just type it out and let's go through together then, like this. So I added the status 200 over here also, but on the line 9, we are setting the headers for the response, and we are saying that the host header equals the host header over here. So let's save it and try it out. So let's make a new request. It returns the correct response, but now if we look at the click over here next to the body, we can see the response headers in Postman. So let's click that and scroll up a little bit, and what do you know, looks like the host header is passed as expected. So that's how you can return headers with the response. So next, let's see how to do redirects with the route handlers. So let me create again a new folder called redirect, and inside of that the route.js. Then here we want to export the get function like this, and then inside of this get function we can just call redirect and say where we want to redirect. So let's say we want to redirect my website like this. And of course we need to import that redirect also. So let's add it up here. And it was from Next Navigation, like this. Let's save it and let's try it out. And for this, I will open up the browser and try it out over there so we can see the redirect in action. So it was API/redirect, like this. So I'll hit enter, and looks like it creates the redirect. So it's that easy to do redirects with route handlers. Next, let's take a look on the dynamic route segments and how we can get the route parameters to our route handlers. So let's again start by adding a new folder, and I will call this DRS, so dynamic route segments. Then I will create a new folder under that and use the brackets and slug inside of them. And then inside of that folder, we want to create the route.js file. So if you're familiar with Next.js routing, this syntax with brackets should be familiar for you. But if it's not, I have videos explaining that, so be sure to check those out from the channel. But for this route.js, let's add the get function also, like this. And let's, for now, return a new response, like this, and test this out that it's working. So I'll open up my Postman, create a new request, and go to the /API/DRS and and then here is the value that will be assigned for the slug over here. So let's just add foobar, like this, and send it, and we are getting the correct message. So let's see how we can modify this so that the message would return the value of this slug, so in this case foobar. First thing we want to do is to add another parameter for this get function, and it will be an object, and inside of that object we want to get the params variable, like this. So this params variable will have all the route parameters in it. So inside of here we can say let slug equals params.slug, like this. Or if we want to make it shorter, let's do it like that. So now we should have in this slug variable the value of foobar in this case. So let's just modify the message to have that slug value in it, like this. So I will save this and open the Postman, and let's test it out. Looks like it's working. So it's returning the foobar. So what if we change this up like this, send it, looks like it's working. And if you had more URL parameters in the route, then you could just have them defined over here and use them in the route handler as we are using the slug over here. Okay, then last, let's see how we can get a request body from a post request. So let me just again create a new folder in the API folder. Let's call it post data, and inside of it create the route handler, like this. And now, since we want to target the post request, let's export the post function over here, like this. Then for now, let's return a new response, like this, and test it out that it's working. So I'll open up my Postman. Let's create a new request, and the URL is /API/postData. And now that we are making a post request, we want to change this get to post, and let's send it away, and looks like it's working. So let's say we had a body, so we can define the request body in the body tab in Postman. And let's say in our body we have a name variable, and we wanted to return that name in the response. So let me just choose the data type in here. So we will be using raw, and it will be JSON. So I'll add some JSON over here. So let's say we have name equals Tuomo, like this. So now whenever we send this JSON will be sent as a request body or as a payload for this request. So let's switch to the VS Code and see how we can get that body from the request. So this is actually something that I used quite a lot of time to figure out, but it turned out to be easier than I expected. So if we want to define a body, we can get the request body from the request by calling request.json like this. And of course add await in front of it because it's a synchronous function. So like this. And now let's modify the message to return the name like this. And let's define the name variable. And it's of course body.name like this. Let's save it and test it out. So my name is Tuomo. Let's send it out. And looks like we are getting the correct value. Now if we change this up a little bit, it's still working. And of course, if we have other variables here, for example, website, like this, we could get these in the route handler like this. So let the website equals body.website like this. And let's modify the message like this, save it, and let's test it out. And it's working. So after all, it's that easy to get the body from the request. And if you're curious on why this works like this, we can actually find the answer from the documentation. So the request parameter that the get and post functions get is type of request. So if we open up the documentation for the request and scroll down over here a little bit, we should see .json function over here. And over here it says that returns a promise that resolves with the result of parsing the request body as JSON. So this is why we can get the body of the request with this .json function. I really hope that you found this video at least somewhat helpful, and if you did, I would highly appreciate it if you left a comment down below, like the video, and also if you're not already, hit the subscribe button below. In today's video, we will learn how to add role-based authorization to our Next.js 13 application. So let's get right into it. Let's get started by opening up this repository in GitHub and cloning it. So I'm gonna click over here and copy the URL and switch to the terminal and paste in git clone and then the repository. Like that. Then I'm gonna open up that repo in VS Code like this. And let's actually quickly check out the GitHub repo one more time. So if we look at the branches we have over here, we have the starting point branch. And how this repo works is that next we want to check out that starting point branch and start working from there. Because what I already did was to set up NextAuth and all the authentication logic in that starting point branch. And that's just to speed things up so we don't have to use time on this video on setting up the NextAuth in the Next.js project. And if you want to learn how to set up the NextAuth for a Next.js 13 project, I have a video about that, so please do check out that on the channel. But now let's check out this one starting point branch in our VS Code. So I'll open up terminal and type in git checkout and then the one starting point branch like this. It looks like we are on it. That's great. So next I will run yarn install like this, and then let's just fire up the application and see how it works. The dev server is running and I'll open up the localhost 3000 and looks like we have a login button or sign in button and a text not signed in. So let's click the sign in and sign in with GitHub. Okay, so one thing we forgot to do was to add environment variables to our application. So I'll switch back to the VS Code and let's create a new file to the root of the directory called .env.local like this. And inside of this file, we want to define 4 environment variables. First is the GitHub secret, then GitHub ID, NextAuth secret, and NextAuth URL. And these are all required for us in order to authenticate with GitHub. So let's add the GitHub secret and GitHub ID. And how we can do that is to go to the GitHub and open up developer settings page. So you can go to this URL and select the OAuth apps, and we can create new OAuth app. And let's give our application a name like this. Then the homepage URL, which is localhost in our case. Then we don't have to add any description. And for the authorization callback URL, we will use this one over here. Now let's click register. And just like that, our application is created and we get the client ID. And this is the value we want to copy and paste in for the GitHub ID environment variable. Then next, we want to generate a new client secret. Let's click that. And it will generate a secret for us, which is this one over here. So I'll copy that, go to the VS Code and paste it in for the GitHub secret. Okay, so now we have all the GitHub stuff in here. For the NextAuth secret, we can just add some secret for now. So I will just add test. And the NextAuth URL, we can add localhost like this. Let's save it. And now I think our application should work. So let's run the dev server. Okay, and switch to the browser. And let's go to the localhost 3000. Okay, let me make this a bit bigger. So let's click the sign in button, sign in with GitHub. Okay, looks like there is something wrong. Looks like it redirects us to the local host. So I think we need to modify the NextAuth URL to be localhost 3000 like this. So let's save that, switch back to the browser, and I'll go to the localhost 3000 again. And let's click sign in with GitHub. Now it asks if we authorize the OAuth app. Let's authorize. And looks like we are signed in. So we get the user information displayed for us over here. And one thing I want to mention about this authentication is that right now the route handlers are new thing for Next.js 13, but NextAuth doesn't work with them yet. So that is why we have still the pages folder inside of here, and we have in it the API route, auth, and the NextAuth.js file, which handles the authentication. So just a heads up for that. So in the future, I'm sure we will have this auth API route inside of this app folder and inside of the route handlers or something similar. But at the moment, the NextAuth is not supported in the app folder, so that's why we are using it in the pages and API route folder. But next, what we actually want to do is add a couple of more pages to this application so we can test the authorization between those pages. So let's start by going to the app folder, and I'll create a new folder called admin dashboard. And inside of it, I'll create the page, or actually I just copy this page file from here and modify it like this. So we are just printing a text. This is admin dashboard. Then I'll create a new folder inside of the app folder called profile page. And again, I'll just copy this page file inside of it and modify it like this. And it just displays this is the profile page text. So let's see if we go to the browser and to the localhost /admin dashboard like this, we get the text. And then if we test the profile page, we get the correct text over there. Great. But in order to make things a bit easier for us, let's add links to those pages to our layout file. So I'll switch to the VS Code and open up the layout file. And over here, I will add those links. So just give me a second. Like this. So what I did was I imported the link from NextLink and added links for the front page to the admin dashboard and the profile page. So let's see the browser. So we get those links up here. So if we go admin dashboard, profile page, front page, and looks like every link is working, which is great. And again, I just want to say that I wanted to keep this application really simple and just to focus on the authorization parts, so it's easier to understand what is related to the authorization and what is not. So that's why this application is pretty simple, as you can see, but hopefully you will learn better through this example. So now when we go between these pages, we can see that we can access all of them because we are signed in, but if we sign out and go to the pages, well, we can see that we can still access them. So the first step, let's add a check for all of these pages that they are only displayed when we are signed in. And if we are not signed in, we will be prompted to sign in. And how we can do that is actually with Next.js middleware. So I will add a middleware.js file to the same level as the app directory is. So middleware.js. And now let's open the NextAuth documentation regarding this middleware right here. So how we can protect our whole application, so every page will require authentication. Well, all we have to do is add this one line to our middleware. So let's copy that and paste it in to the middleware, save it, and let's switch to the browser. And let's try to access the admin dashboard. And looks like we are prompted with the sign in. So we can't access the admin dashboard because we are not signed in. So let's try the profile page. Same thing. So let's actually sign in and see what happens. So now we are on the profile page. Now we can access the admin page and the front page. But as you might have seen, if we sign out and go to the front page, like this, it will also prompt us for the sign in. And this is actually something we don't want. So let's modify the middleware so that only the admin dashboard and the profile page require us to sign in. So I'll switch back to the VS Code and let me add one line of code over here and I'll explain it after that. Okay, so what I did was I exported this config variable from this middleware, and inside of that I can define a matcher, which is an array of routes that we want to match this middleware for. So right now this middleware should be only run for the admin dashboard route and the profile page route. So let's see. I'll switch to the browser. I'll go to the localhost 3000. And looks like we get the front page rendered. And now if we click the admin dashboard, we are prompted with sign in. So looks like it's working. So let's sign in. And now we can access the profile page, admin page, and the front page. Okay, so now our admin dashboard and profile page is protected with the sign in. So we need to sign in order to access them. But let's say we wanted to only access or grant access for this admin dashboard for users that have the role admin. So let's see how we can do that next. So first we need to modify our middleware file, and let's do it so that I'll add the code over here and let's go through it together after that. Okay, so here's what the middleware looks like now. So in order for us to add some authorization for the application, we need to use this with auth from the NextAuth middleware, and we will export it by default. And inside of that, we will define a middleware function and then also some callbacks functions. So let's start with the callbacks actually. We are defining an authorized function, and if this function returns true, it will pass the authorization, and if it returns false, the authorization will fail. So in this case, we are getting the JWT token from the parameters and then just checking that it exists. So if it exists, we know that the user is authenticated, and if not, then we will return false and prompt the user with the sign in. So that will be run first. And if that returns true, then this middleware function will be run. And inside of this, we are checking that if the path name is the admin dashboard, so we can access the path name from the request and next URL. So if the path name is the admin dashboard and the role is something else than admin, then we are just returning a new response saying that, hey, you are not authorized, and we are not going to the actual admin dashboard page. So in this case, we are accessing the role from the token, which can be accessed in the NextAuth variable of the request. And right now, when we are using GitHub, we are actually not getting a role property in the token. So this should fail right now. So let's test it out. So if I save this and switch to the browser and try to access the admin dashboard, let me refresh the page. We are getting the you are not authorized. And that's just because GitHub doesn't return a role parameter. So if we want to modify the token in the application, we can do that. So let's open the NextAuth.js file. And inside of here, we can, for the auth options, define callbacks. And if we want to add a role for the token, just to test this out so that it works, we can do the following, like this. So we are defining a callback called JWT, and we can access the token from the parameters. And right here, we are just setting the role for the token and then returning that token. So when we do it like this, the token inside of the request over here will have the role that we defined in the NextAuth callbacks in this JWT callback. So let's test this out. I will save this, switch to the browser, and let's refresh the page. And actually, I think we need to relog. So let me sign out, sign in with GitHub. Okay, we are signed in. And now if we access the admin dashboard, we can see the text over there. So now we are authorized for it. And now if we go back and let's say that our role would be member, save it. I will sign out, sign in, and try to access the admin dashboard. We can see that it gives the not authorized message. Hopefully this didn't feel too complicated and you got at least some idea on how the authorization and role-based authorization works inside of the Next.js 13 and NextAuth. As said, I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are not already. In today's video, we will take a look on how to add internationalization to your Next.js 13 app using the app router. We will first take a look on how to add the internationalization for server components, and then also how to use the translations in client components. So let's get started. So in order to add internationalization for our application, we are using this NextIntel library. And as they say right here, they are supporting the Next.js 13 and the app router. So let's actually click that open. And if that's not there, I think you can click the get started and then go down here, Next.js 13 and get started. And right here, they are saying that with Next.js 13 and the app router, there are two major changes when using the NextIntel. And the first one is that Next.js has removed their built-in internationalization routing, and the second being that Next.js now supports React server components. And in order to leverage these new capabilities of Next.js, NextIntel supports now client components, middleware for I18N routing, localized navigation APIs, and server components. And just a heads up that at the time of recording this video, the support for server components is still in beta. So that's just something to keep in mind when using them. But let's click that server components open and let's see how we can add internationalization for our server components. So before diving any deeper into this, let's first just create a fresh Next.js application that we can add this internationalization for. So I'm gonna open up my terminal and I'm gonna create a new Next.js app using the create next app. And once that's run, let's open up that in VS Code like this. And then let's do some cleanup. So I'm gonna open up the app and page file and just remove everything from the return, call, and add a div and a paragraph inside of it and say just hello world like this. Let's delete those imports and save it. And let's open the terminal and just fire up the dev server like this. And I'll switch to the browser and go to localhost 3000. And I'm gonna open up my DevTools also. So, okay, we see hello world. So our application is running, which is great. So let's hop back into the NextIntel tutorial. Okay, so first they're saying that the current beta version is this one over here. And if you're watching this later on, this can be a different version or the support for server components is already out of beta. So just keep an eye on this version and use that in your own project if you are following along. So what I'm gonna do is just copy this version over here and switch to the VS Code and just add that as a dependency. So yarn add and then that version like this. Okay, let's switch back to the browser and scroll down a little bit. So to get started, we first need this kind of folder structure for our application. Let me just make this a bit bigger like this. So if we look over here, we will have a messages folder which holds the actual translations. So NextIntel uses the term messages for those translations. And inside of that folder, we will have all our JSON files, which include the translations. Then we need i18n configuration file, and then we should have the next config file, which we already have, but I assume we have to do some modifications for that. Then we need the middleware file, and this is important. So inside of the app directory, we want to create this kind of folder and then put all of our other pages inside of that folder. So that's how the NextIntel will know which local we want to use. So let's get started by adding the messages file. So let's add it for English. So I'm just gonna copy it from here, switch to the browser and create a new folder called messages. And inside of that, I will create a new file called en.json and paste in the JSON like this. Then let's see in the browser the next step. So next, let's add this i18n configuration file. And I'm gonna actually copy all of this right now and switch to the VS Code and create that actual file. So it was i18n, and on the website it was TS, but I'm just gonna use JS over here. That works also. And let's paste in the code. So what happens in here is that with this configuration file, we will define which translations or messages we want to load for a given local. So that's used for it. Let's switch to the browser and take the next step. So we want to modify the next config.js file. And for this, I'm gonna actually copy just these 4 lines over here and go to the VS Code and open up my next config file. And what I'm gonna do is paste in those 2 lines over here, and then I will change this TS to JS because this defines the configuration file we want to use, and as we just made it a JS file, we want to rename it over here too. And then I'm just gonna use this with NextIntel and wrap the next config inside of it when exporting it. So like this. and let's save it. And let's see the next step. So the step 4 is to modify our middleware. And again, I'm just gonna copy this from here, switch to the VS Code and create that middleware file and paste in the code. And over here, what we are doing is we are importing this create middleware from NextIntel middleware, and we are giving it parameters over here. So with these locals, we can define which locals are allowed in our application. And with this default local, we can define what local to use as a default if none other is provided. And then this export config stuff is basic Next.js middleware stuff. So right here we are just skipping all the paths that should not be internationalized. And I'm gonna actually modify this and add FI. So our application will support English and Finnish. So let's save it. And now let's switch to the browser. And now actually, before going to the 5th step, let's try to run our application. So I'm gonna start the dev server and switch to the browser and localhost 3000. And we are getting actually the not found error. So let's see. Okay, so what we actually forgot to do is the one important stuff, which was to move all these files in a local folder. So let's create that local folder over here and move everything except the icon inside of that folder, like this. So now let's see the browser and refresh the page. And now we get the hello world text. So our application is working. So now let's take a look on the next step. So what we want to do is modify the layout file. And for this, I'm just gonna copy these 2 lines from here. Let's copy them and paste them into our layout file. So the layout.js, and up here I will paste those imports, and let's just paste in everything we need, and then let's go through it together. So we need those, and let's copy these lines, and they go inside the layout component like this. And then the last thing we want to do is pass in the local as a lang parameter. So let's copy and paste that over there like this. So what we are doing here is importing the use local from NextIntel and then not found page from the next navigation. And inside of the component, we can get the current local with this use local hook. And that's what we are doing in here. And this if clause just checks that if our local is available, and if it's not, then we are just gonna show a not found page. And then over here we configure that the document language is the given local. And one thing we still need is to add that params into the props like this. So this is all we need to do to configure the whole document's language. So I'm gonna save this and let's see in the browser that we don't get any errors. Let's refresh the page. Okay, everything is still working. So now we are getting the hello world text, but if we look at the page that we are rendering in there, so this one over here, we are just displaying the hello world text. So the next step is actually translate this sentence, and let's jump into the browser and see how that's done. So we can translate words or sentences in our server components by importing this import use translations and then using it like this over here. So let's just first import that. So I'm gonna go our page.js and import that, and then I will copy this line from here to our component like this. So now we have this t, which is a function available in our component. And if we want to translate this word, we will call that function with a string parameter saying which word we want to translate or which sentence. So let's try it out. So T, and then we want to translate the title. So let's save it, and I'll switch to the browser, and we can see the hello world still. So this is important to note that we are not actually passing the whole sentence or word that we want to translate, but we are passing as a parameter the key for that sentence or word that we want to translate, and those keys are inside of the JSON file right here. So in here we wanted to translate the title, and we can see that it gets the translation from here if we just add, for example, one more exclamation mark and save it and switch to the browser. And I think we need to refresh the page for this. So yeah, so now it gets 2 exclamation marks. And if we take one more look at the use translation hook, so with this hook we can get the translations, and as a parameter we can define a scope, which can be a component or other scope that you want to define. And in our case, we're using index. And why we are using index is because in our translation file, we define it right here. So if this was something else, we would use that in our use translation hook over here. So now that we can translate some sentences, let's see how we can change the language in our application. So let me just write some code and let's go through it together then. Okay, so what I did was to add this section over here. So we still have our title rendered over there, but then we are rendering 2 links, which will have the text in English and in Finnish. And these are not actually Next.js links, but they are the NextIntel links. And if we quickly take a look on the NextIntel documentation, we can see down here we have the navigation, and we can see that the link component actually wraps the next link component. So it uses the next link under the hood, but what it does also is it adds this local prop that we can use. So let's go back to the VS Code and see our links over here. So we are passing the href, so we just want to go to the root of the website, but then we are also passing the local, and this is the part that will define the new local that will be used. So with our link with text in English, we'll change it to English, and with in Finnish, it will change it to Finnish. So let's save this and go to the browser and see if it works. So I'm gonna refresh the page, and right here we have the in English and in Finnish links. So let's just click the in English. Nothing happens because it's already in English. But then if we click the in Finnish, we will actually get an error right now. And that is because we haven't defined our Finnish translations yet. So let's do that next. So in our messages folder, I will actually just copy this en.json and paste it in over there and rename it as fi.json. And in here, I will add the Finnish translation like this. Let's save it. And now let's go to the browser and refresh the page. And we can see our translation over there. Now, if we click in English, it will change it to English, and in Finnish, it will change it to Finnish. And you can also notice that the local is added to the URL up here. So now let's see if we wanted to add another word to our page or another sentence. So right here, we wanted to add a subtitle, and we can do it like this and then save it. And now if we go to the browser, we can see that it shows the key for that translation. And that's because we haven't defined that translation to our translation files yet. So let's do that. So I'm gonna open up the English version. I will add that over here like this, and then I will add also the Finnish version like this. Let's save both and go to the browser, and we can see that our translations are now displayed. So if I click English, it shows it in English, and in Finnish, it shows it in Finnish. That's great. So that's how we can use translations with the server components. But how about client components? Well, let's take a look on the documentation of NextIntel. And actually down here, they are already saying that if you are in a transitioning phase, either from pages directory to the app directory or from client components to server components beta, you can apply this NextIntel client provider additionally. And this is one way to add it, but we won't take a look on that in this video. If you want to learn more about that way, you can check it out from their documentation. But what we are going to use is actually what they recommend in the server components section. And what they're saying is that the best approach is to pass the labels as props or children from a server component. And they have a couple of examples over here. But let's try that out and let's try to use the translations in client components by passing them as props. So I'm gonna switch back to the VS Code and let's create a new component in our local folder. And I will call this just alert message.js like this. And I will export a function from here like this, save it, and let's import it in our page.js up here like this. And then let's use it, let's say down here. And let's save it and let's just see the browser. So everything is working. We are getting the message down here, and I'm just gonna actually add one BR over there so we get some space like that. Okay, good. So we are getting the message down here, and that's of course because we just rendered it down here. And for our test, we wanted this to be client component, so let's add that use client up here. Let's save it and see that everything is still working. Looks like it. But now if we want to translate this text over here, the recommended way is to pass this as a prop. So what I'm gonna do is add a message prop over here and then use that down here like this. So we are getting the message to display as a prop, and then we are displaying it over here. And this is now a client component because we added the use client up here. So I'm gonna save this and let's go to the page.js. And now we want to pass in that translation as a prop. So let's add the message prop, and that will be, and let's again use the T function as before. And let's say this is alert message like this. Save it. And now if we take a look on the browser, we can again see that it just displays the key or the name of that translation word or sentence. So we still need to add that. So I'm going to open up the en.json and add the alert message over here. And let's say it was something went wrong like this. Save it. And let's add that same to the Finnish translations like this. Let's save it. And now see the browser. I will refresh the page. And now if we have English, it says something went wrong. And if we change to Finnish, it looks like it shows the correct translation. So that's how you can use the translations in a client component by passing them as props and using the translation function in the server component. So that's how you can add internationalization to your Next.js 13 app using the app router. And I know there are also a bunch of other libraries that can help you adding the translations to your next application, but I decided to use the NextIntel because they already had support for the Next.js 13 app directory, and not all of the libraries did have that. I truly hope that you found this video at least somewhat helpful, and if you did, please leave a like and comment down below, and if you're not already, also subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on new Next.js videos. In today's video, we will take a look on how to add dark and light mode to your Next.js application. We will first see how to add a theme changer to your application, and then how to display or manipulate the CSS based on the selected theme. And then we will also take a look on how we can utilize this theme changer with Tailwind CSS. So let's get started. So first, I will create a new Next.js application with create next app. And I will choose no for TypeScript, no for ESLint, no for Tailwind CSS for now, no for SRC. Then we will want to use the app router, so yes, and for this no, and let's wait for it to run. Okay, great. Let's open it up in VS Code like this, and I will just fire up the dev server to see that everything is working. Let's open the browser, go to the localhost 3000, and let's see the application. Okay, looks like everything is okay. So just to make everything really clear, I will create a very basic example of the changing of the theme. So what I'm going to do is open up the app folder, then from there the page.js, and I will actually clean everything from this page.js file like this, and then I will just return a div with a paragraph saying hello world like this. And I can remove these from up here, and let's save it and switch to the browser, and looks like we are getting the hello world text. Okay, good. So in order for us to change the theme and get the current theme, we will use this next themes npm package. So let's go and install it. I will copy this from here, go to the VS Code, stop the server, and paste in the yarn add command like this. So now we have the library added. So I'm gonna yarn dev again, so we get our dev server back on and see in the browser that it's working. Looks like everything is okay. Great. So let's switch back to the VS Code. And over here, I will open up the layout file. So with app directory, this is the layout file. And from here, I'm just gonna delete this font stuff, and then also from down here, like this, because we don't need those right now. And then also open up the global.css file and just remove everything from here too. So that's the file that we are importing up here. Okay, so in order for us to add the theming for this application, we need to import a theme provider from Next Themes. So let's do that like this. And then we need to wrap our content down here inside of the theme provider. So let's do that like this. So let's save it and check out the browser. So looks like we are getting an error saying that create context only works in client components. And this is because our layout.js is now a server component. And if we wanted to use this as a client component, we would need to add this use client directive at the top of the file over here. But that's something we don't want to do at the moment. We want to keep it as a server component because there is another way to add this theme provider over here without converting this to a client component. So let's see how that's done. So what I'm going to do is actually add a new file to our app folder called providers.js like this. And over here, I will import the theme provider. So I will copy it from the layout and remove it from there. And then I will actually just return a component from here like this. And right now I'm just returning the children in a div. But what we actually want to do is to wrap these children in a theme provider. So over here, I will replace this div with theme provider like this. And now if I go to the layout.js, I can get rid of this theme provider over here. And what I want to do is import that providers component we just created. So let's do that like that. And then let's wrap these children inside of that provider component like this. Let's save it and see if we still get an error. So it looks like we are getting an error. It's the same error. And actually this is because our providers component is also a server component because we are not defining this as a client component. So you remember that with app directory, all the components are by default server components if we don't define them as client components. So in order for this to work, let's make this a client component like this. So now our providers.js is a client component, and we are wrapping the children inside of it, and that way adding the theme provider for our application. So let's save everything and switch to the browser, and looks like we are getting a hello world, so we got rid of all those errors. Okay, so right now our text is black and the background is white. And what we want to do is be able to change the theme so all this changes. So the next step is to create a theme changer, or this kind of switch or drop down that we can select the theme that we want to use. So let's do that next. I will go to the VS Code and I'll create a new component inside of our app folder called theme switcher. And let me just add some code over here and let's then go through it together. Okay, so first, in order to change the theme, we need to import the use theme hook from the next themes. And then over here, we are just defining our theme switcher component and then using the use theme hook to get the current theme and also to change the theme. And then we render the current theme just as a text and then button for setting the light mode and dark mode. So when clicked, we are just calling the set theme function and passing in the theme as a parameter. So this should be everything we need. So let's save this and go to the layout.js file. And I want to add this to the top of the page so we can see it on every page. So let's first import it like this, and then we can render it down here like this. Let's save it and switch to the browser to see if it works. Okay, we get the client component error, so we forgot to make this a client component. So let's do that like this. So let's save it and switch to the browser and let's see what we get. Okay, so we get the current theme over here and the light mode and dark mode buttons, but it looks like we have a couple of errors. So let's tackle those right now. So we are getting an error hydration failed because the initial UI does not match what was rendered on the server. So this error is actually because the theme is only known on the client side on the browser, and when rendered on the server, we don't know what the theme is. So some of the values for the use theme hook, for example, are undefined. So we are getting this hydration error because of that. And in order to fix this, we can do this one thing that they actually mention in the npm page of the next themes over this avoid hydration mismatch section. So the idea here is that if we scroll down a little bit over here, they have a version of the theme switcher. So what we can do is render the UI that uses the current theme only when the page is mounted on the client side. We can do it like they list over here. So let's add this to our application. So what I'm going to do first is go to the VS Code and open our theme switcher. And up here, I will import the use state and use effect hooks like this. Then inside the component, I will create a piece of state called mounted like this, and it will default to false. And then before the rendering part, I will just add if statement checking that if it's not mounted, return null. And also we want to add a use effect in which we set the set mounted to true like this. And then let's add the dependency error like this, save it. So right now, when this component is mounted on the client side, this use effect will be called and the set mounted set to true. And then after that, this part will be rendered. And because we are on the client side, we will know the theme already. So it should work. So this was the theme switcher. So one other place we need to add this same kind of logic is the providers. So let me just do that and let's continue from there like this. And one difference between this and the theme switcher one is that now when the component is not mounted, instead of returning a null, we will return the children wrapped with React fragments. So this is the shorthand for React fragments. Okay, let's save this and switch to the browser and see if we get anything in here. So I'll refresh the page and looks like the errors disappeared and we no longer get any warnings down here either. Okay, great. So now it's time to do some styling. So I will open up the globals.css file, and in here I will add some CSS to style our light mode and dark mode. So let's start with the light mode. So I will just modify the body element for this example. So let's do a simple one. Select color to set it black and the background color set it to white like this. So let's add some styles for the dark mode too. And how we can do that is by targeting the data theme and checking if that is dark. And I will select the body also. And here, let's say we want to set the background color to black and color to white. So the opposite ones for the light mode. Let's save this and switch to the browser and see what happens. So now we are on the light theme currently. So let's click the dark mode and looks like the background goes to black and the text stays white. And if we go to light mode, it changes again. So it looks like our styles are working. And the reason why the dark mode works, so why we use this kind of syntax when targeting the dark mode styles, is because if we click right here and select inspect and check out the HTML element, we can see that it has the data theme attribute with the value of dark. And if we click the light mode, it will set the theme to light. So that's why we can target the dark mode with this kind of syntax in our CSS. And this is the default behavior of the theme provider. And we will actually use different kind of behavior when we are using TailwindCSS, and I will show you an example of that in just a minute. And one thing I want to mention is that if we take a closer look on this HTML element, and when we change the themes, we can see that the color scheme is also changing for the style attribute. And what this does, and actually let me open up a documentation. So if you are not familiar with color scheme, it's a CSS property that allows an element to indicate which color scheme it can comfortably be rendered in. So if we set it to dark, it will automatically use these dark values, and with light, the light values. So actually, if we change back to our application and go to the VS Code, and actually if we delete our styles from here and save this, I think this should still work. So let's refresh the page, and right now it's the light mode, but now if I go to the dark mode, we can see that the dark mode is activated. And that's because the color scheme is set to dark also when selecting the dark mode. But just for example purposes, so how we can target the different themes, I will leave this over here. And of course, we don't have to use these styles. So let's say we wanted to have the text as red when using the dark mode. We can change it up here, switch to the browser, and the text is displayed red when dark mode, and in light mode it will be black. So if you need some custom CSS for your elements, this might be the way you want to go with. But if you just want to add this default dark behavior, you don't even need this CSS over here. All you need is to add this providers.js and then use it in your layout.js file like this. And of course, add the theme switcher, and you could make this nicer. Right now, I just made it 2 buttons to make it easy and simple. So this is how you can use the themes to manipulate the basic CSS. So next, let's see how we can set up this theme changer with Tailwind CSS. Okay, so next let's see how to use this theme changer with Tailwind CSS. So what I'm going to do is actually create a new fresh Next.js application with Tailwind CSS. So I will stop this server over here and go back to my terminal. And right here, I will just create a new Next.js application like this. So I will hit enter. And for this, I don't want to use TypeScript, neither ESLint, but for Tailwind CSS, I will select yes. And no for src, yes for app router, and no here. And let's wait it to run. Okay, let's open it up in VS Code like this. And for this also, I will just open the page and remove everything from here as we did last time. And then just return a div with a text like this. And I will also just remove this import from here. Let's save it. Next, let's just fire the dev server and see that everything is working. I will switch to the browser and refresh the page, and looks like we are getting the hello world. And we are actually getting it as a dark theme already, and that's because my system theme is dark, and this recognizes that, and that way it shows the dark theme already. But next, let's add the theme switcher we did earlier. So I'm gonna go to the VS Code and add the yarn add next themes. And now we want to add the provider again. So what I'm actually gonna do is switch back to the first application and just copy everything from our providers.js and switch back to the new application with Tailwind CSS and create a providers file like this, paste in the code and save it. And then for the layout, I will switch back to the first application and just copy this whole layout also from here, and then back to the new application, select everything and paste in the code. So now we are still missing the theme switcher. So let's do the same thing for that. So switch to the old application, copy the theme switcher, everything from there, and then back to the new application, create a new file for that theme switcher and paste in the code like this. Let's save it. And now if we open the dev server and switch to the browser, we are getting the hello world and the theme changer up here, and it looks a bit nasty, but these should be buttons. So when clicked, we are actually changing the theme, as we can see. So when we click the light mode, the theme will be changed to light, and with dark mode, it will be changed to dark. And let me actually switch back to the VS Code and modify the theme switcher a bit. I will add line breaks over here. Let's save it and see it again. So now the current theme is dark. With light mode, it goes to light. Dark mode, it goes to dark. And we can see up here that the data theme is changing as it was earlier. But now it's not working because with Tailwind, we need to actually use something else. So let's go back to the VS Code. And when using Tailwind, we need to pass for this theme provider a prop called attribute. And as a value for that, we want to pass in class like this. So let's save it. And now if we go to the browser, let's refresh the page. So now when we change between the themes, we can see that there is no longer a data theme attribute, but there is now a class that is changed based on the theme. So that's how Tailwind uses it. And now we still have everything in black. So let's add some Tailwind styles to style our application. So first I'm gonna actually open the global.css and I will remove everything from here except the Tailwind imports up here. So let's save it and let me just see in the browser if anything changes. Okay, so now we are getting the light mode and dark mode when switching the themes. And this is now because the color scheme style attribute. So we are still not using the Tailwind, but bear with me. So now that we removed everything from the global CSS, let's switch back to the page component. So over here we have the hello world. So now let's say we wanted to make this text red whenever we are using the dark mode. Well, with Tailwind CSS, we can do that with classes. So if we want to target a dark mode style or add a style or add a class when the dark mode is active, we can do that by typing in dark, colon, and then the class we want to add. And for this, let's add text red 900 like this. So now whenever the dark mode is active, this class will be applied for this div. So let's save it and switch to the browser. And we can see that it's now displayed in red since we have the dark mode active. So let's switch to the light mode and we can still see actually that the text is red. And this is because we still need to add one configuration to our application. So right now the text red 900 class is applied to this text whether or not the theme is light or dark. So in order for us to have this dark theme working with Tailwind CSS, we need to still modify the Tailwind config.js over here. So let's open that up. And inside here, we need to add a dark mode attribute and set it to class. So what this basically tells to Tailwind is that the dark mode information will be found from the class of the HTML element. So now let's save this and switch back to the browser. And what do you know? Now the text is black. So if we switch to the dark mode, the text is red, and with light mode, it's black. So that's all you have to do in order to use the dark or light mode with Tailwind CSS. In this video, we will build a to-do list application with Next.js 13. By building this application, we will learn about the app folder, server and client components, data fetching and data mutations, and much more. We will be focusing on the technical aspects of building this application, so we won't be doing much of styling, for example. So let's get started. So here I have a fresh Next.js application open. And what I will do is actually delete the pages folder because we won't need that because we are using the app folder which came with Next.js 13. So we will add that, and inside of that folder add a page.js file. And from this file I will just export a function like this, and let's save it and try to run the server. And we get this error that we need to add the experimental app dir through to the Next.js config file because right now the app dir is still experimental. So I'll just add that over there, save it, and try to run the server again, and then switch to the browser and try to open up the localhost 3000. And looks like everything is working. We get the hello text over there. So for the structure of the application, I'm thinking that at the top we will have a text input and a button that you can use to add to-dos. And then below that we just have a list of those to-dos, and for each to-do we can mark it done with a checkbox or delete it with a button. So let's switch back to the VS Code and start working on that. So I'll open up the layout.js file from the app folder, and over here I will just add a heading for our application like this and save it. Let's see the browser. Yeah, great. And then I will switch to the page.js file, and over here I will type some code to just demonstrate our application the way I just described, like this. So what I did here is at the top we have, inside of this div, we have the text input and the button, and then over here in this div we have the list with some simple styling and a couple of list items that represent the to-dos. So let's see how this looks, and I think this looks good. And for the checkbox and delete button, I think we will add those later on. So for now I think this looks good. So this is the basic structure for our to-do list app. So next what we will do is create own components for this input stuff and then these to-dos. So let's start with the input stuff. So I will create a new file over here called add new to-do, and inside of here I will export a function, and then I will go to the page.js and just copy all this code and remove it, and then paste it in here and return it like this. And then we still need to use this component in the page, so I will import it and then render it over here like this. So let's try to save this and see if everything is still working. Looks like it is. Great. So next I want to create a new component for this code over here. And again, I will create a new file and call it to-do list and export a function. And same thing here, I will go to the page and copy and remove that code and paste it in and return it inside of here like this. And then let's import that also and then render it down here like this and see that everything is still working. Great. So now we have separated this text input and button to its own component and this list of to-dos down here to its own component. And this is kind of important. Well, first of all, it's easier to understand the application code right now, but also because they are right now rendered as server components, but later on we will actually need to render one of those as a client component. So that's why it's good also that they are separated to their own components. So next up, let's start to work on this to-do list component. So as we can see, at the moment, we are just rendering some static to-dos over here. But the goal is to actually fetch the to-dos from an API and then display them over here. And for fetching the to-dos, I actually have an API running locally that is running in localhost 3001/API/todo/list. And as we can see, it returns bunch of to-dos. And this API also has other endpoints for adding to-dos, updating to-dos, and removing or deleting to-dos. And this is the API we will use. And if you want to follow along and check out this simple mock API also, it's on my GitHub. I will leave a link down below in the description. But you can just go ahead to the repository, click here, and then copy over here and clone it on your own computer, and then run yarn install, yarn build, and yarn start, and that should work. So this is the API we will be using for this to-do list application. And let's start by fetching the to-dos inside of the to-do list component. So up here, I will add a new function for fetching the data like this. So first we will use fetch to make that API request, and then we will return that response that the API returns. And now we can use this function inside of the component. So let's add it over here like this. And then we also need to mark this function as async like this. And let's actually log these to-dos like this, so we can see that the request is working and we are getting the data. So let's save this and go to the browser and refresh the page. And right now we don't see anything on the JavaScript console, and that is because this component is a server component, because all the components inside of the app folder are by default server components if we don't define them as client components separately. So we need to look at the console inside of this server. So right here we can see that we got the data logged in. So we got some to-dos from the API with ID name and isDone properties. So that's great. The request is working. So only thing left to do now is to actually map through those to-dos and display them over here. So let me just add the code for that like this. So what we are doing here is mapping through the to-dos and then just printing a list element for each to-do, displaying the name. So let's save this and switch to the browser and let's refresh the page. And looks like it's working. It's displaying the to-dos from the API, which is great. So next, let's add the checkbox for marking the to-do as done, and then also the delete button for deleting a to-do. So let me just add them over here real quick, like this. And let's save it and check it out in the browser. Everything looks okay, good. So next, let's add the functionality for this checkbox So we want to be able to check it to mark the to-do as done. And when we check it, we want to make an API request updating the server saying that, hey, this to-do is done. So in order to do that, we need to add onChange handler for this checkbox. So let's do that. And for now, I will just add an empty function to test this out. So I will save it and let's switch to the browser. And we can see that we get an error. And this error is now related to the server and client components. So whenever we are using onChange handler, onClick handler, or useState or useEffect hooks, for example, we need to use client components. But since we are only needing the onChange handler for this checkbox and eventually for this delete button, we don't want to convert this whole component, this to-do list component, to a client component, because in that case, this API request would also happen on the client side, and that way it wouldn't be good for the performance compared for this API request to be run on the server. So what we will do next is actually create a new component for a single to-do item. So let's do that. I'll add a file over here. Let's call it to-do. And from here, I will export a function like this. And then I will copy the contents of the li from the to-do list and remove them from there. And then just return them from this component like this. So let's save it. And inside of the to-do list, let's import that component like this and then render it over here. And in order to display the correct name over here, we still need to pass in the to-do as a prop for it. So let's do that like this. And then I will go to the to-do component and modify this so it uses the to-do prop like this. So it gets the to-do as a prop, and then for now we just use the name of that to-do to display it over here. So I'll save that, and then of course we still need to add the use client statement for this to-do component because it's a client component like this. So let's save it, switch back to the browser and refresh the page, and looks like it's working again. Great. So now that we have this to-do component created, let's add the logic for the checkbox so that when we check it, it will update the API that this to-do is done. So I will next add a function up here that will do the updating like this. So we have this update function that will take the to-do ID and the isDone value as a parameter, and then we will use fetch to make the update request to the API. So the update endpoint is in my localhost 3001 API to do update. And the method is post, and then as a body, we will pass in the ID and is done. So next, we just need to call this function in the onChange handler of this checkbox. So let's do that next. Like this. So we will call it with the to-do ID and then get the checked value from the checkbox. So let's save this and actually see how it looks. So I will go to the browser and I have the network tab open, and let's click this one as done, and we get an error, and from the JavaScript console we can see that it's a course error. So we can fix this by adding to our fetch a mode property saying no course like this. Let's save it and refresh the page and then try to click it again. And now we can see we got a request over here. It's a post request, and as a payload it sent the ID of the to-do and then isDone true. Now let's check if the update was successful. So I have the API endpoint open over here. So I refresh the page and looks like it set the first to-do isDone as true. So the updating is working. But as we can see, if we refresh the page, the checkbox is unchecked again. But if we check the API, we can see that the isDone is still true for the first to-do. So let's fix that next. So we need to check a checkbox if the isDone is true for that given to-do. So I'll switch to the VS Code, and for the checkbox I will add a checked property and set it equal to todo.isDone, like this. So now if the task is done, the checkbox should be checked. So let's see. So I will refresh the page and looks like it is checked. So that's good. But now if I try to check another one, so I will check this one, nothing happens. So the checkbox is not checked. And that's because we need to refresh this list in order to show the updated information. So how can we do this in Next.js 13? Well, if we take a look on the Next.js docs, we can see that the Next.js team is working on a new RFC for mutating data in Next.js, and this has not been published yet. So for now, they are recommending this kind of pattern that we use this router refresh function. And they have an example over here. So basically, in the component, we need to call this refresh function after we have done the update, and we will pass that refresh function as a parameter for that data fetching function or the update function. And the refresh function is actually coming from the Next.js router. So we are using this use router over here in the component, and we are importing the use router from Next Navigation. So let's actually just implement that, and I think it's much more clearer what we need to do. So first, let's import that use router from the Next Navigation. Okay, and then we need to, inside the component, define that router and use the use router, like this. And then we want to pass in as a parameter for that update function, that router.refresh function, like this. And then lastly, let's add that as a parameter for the update function, like this. And then after the fetch request, we want to call it. So let's do that like this. So what this router refresh function that we are calling over here does exactly is that it refreshes the current route without making a whole page refresh. And that way the to-do list component will be re-rendered on the server, and it will make this fetch request in the server and get the updated data with the correct values for the isDones and for all of the to-dos. So that way, when the data is updated, it should show a correct checked value for each to-do. So let's try it out. So let's save this one over here and switch to the browser. And just in case, I will refresh my page. So I have two checkboxes checked. So now if I try to check this one over here, looks like it's working. And if I try to uncheck some of these, looks like they are working. And if I refresh the page and check the API, looks like everything is as it should. So if I check that one and check the API, the data is updated over here as we can see. Yeah, so looks like our isDone functionality is working. So next, let's add the functionality for the delete. So I will switch to the VS Code, and over here for the delete button, let's first add an on-click handler. So when it is clicked, something happens. And for now, I will leave it as an empty function because let's first define that delete function, what will be called when we click this. So up here, I will create a new function like this. And as a parameters, this function will get the to-do ID. And then since we are deleting to-dos, we probably want to do the same thing as we did with the update functionality. And that is to refresh the data after the deletion is complete. So we want to pass in the refresh function also. And then inside of the function, let's call that delete API endpoint like this. So again, I'm using fetch to call that localhost 3001/API/todo/delete endpoint. And as a query parameter, I'm passing the to-do ID that I want to delete. And then we are defining the request method, which is delete. And after this, we want to do the refreshing again. So let's do that like this. So let's save it and switch to the browser. I'll refresh this page also, and then let's try deleting this one over here. So nothing happens, and I think we forgot to hook it up on the onClick handler, so let's still do that. Like this, so we are calling the delete to-do function and passing the to-do ID as the first parameter, and then again the router refresh as a second parameter. So now let's save this and switch to the browser, and let's try to delete this one over here. And we are getting an error, and it's again saying about the course policy, so let's add that like so. I'll save it, switch to the browser, and let's try it again. Okay, so now we are getting an error saying that delete is unsupported in no course mode. So we can't do these method delete requests when the mode is set to no course. So there is a couple of ways we can get around this problem. And the way I'm thinking is by adding a rewrite to our Next.js config. So I'm going to go to VS Code, and let's open up the next.config.js again. And I will go ahead and add a rewrite rule over here and then explain it like this. And if you're not familiar with rewrites, you can read about them from the documentation more, but basically what we can do with them is, as they say here, rewrites allow you to map an incoming request path to a different destination path. So in our case, it means that whenever we are in the client side calling /API/something, so this syntax means that, we will in fact call this HTTP localhost 3001 /API/ and then whatever was after that API/ in the source request. So for example, if we called /API/todo, then it would route that request to localhost 3001 /API/todo. So that's in short what that does. So let's save this, and whenever we are making modifications to the next.config.js, we need to reboot our server, so let's do that. And now what we still need to do is inside the to-do component, when we are doing this delete request, well, first of all, we need to move that mode no course because it wasn't supported with delete. But then for the URL, we don't want to call the localhost 3001 anymore, but rather call just like this. So /API/todo/delete and then the ID. So right now, when we are using it like this, it actually routes the request to the localhost 3001 as we defined in the Next.js config over here. So let's save this and let's try it out. So I'll go to the browser, refresh the page, and let's try deleting this last one over here. And at least it disappeared. And if we take a look on the API and let's refresh it, looks like the deletion was successful. So if we also refresh this to-do list page, we can see that the to-do was deleted. So it's working. And now that we have the rewrite configured, we can actually also do the same thing for this update route over here, like this. So I will save that, and now if we check these checkboxes, it will still work because this request will be routed to localhost 3001 /API/todo/update. And for this also we can remove the course definition because that's no longer needed. Okay, so now that we have modified this fetch request in the to-do component, you might also remember that, hey, didn't we do a request for getting the to-dos in the to-do list component over here? And that's correct, we did. So why don't we use the /API/todo/list without the localhost 3001 prefix, so like this, because now we made the rewrite and this should work. So let's try it out. So I will save this and switch the browser, and as you can see, we get an error. So what's going on in here? Why isn't it working? It says that failed to parse URL from API to-do list. And the reason why this doesn't work in here is that this to-do list component is a server component. So the request is made in the server rather than in the client. So that's why we can't do this in the server component, so the rewrite rule doesn't work in the server component, and we need to use the static URL for it, so with the localhost 3001 and then /API/ all that stuff. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that again, this is a server component and it's rendered on the server, rather than this to-do component is a client component and it will be rendered on the client, and these fetch requests will be done in the browser rather than in the server. That's just something that I wanted to point out to you, because I don't think it's really clear at first. Because to be honest, I struggled with this for a while. I was trying to understand why isn't it working, and then I realized that oh, this is a server component and that's why it isn't working. So hopefully that will save some headache from you at some point. But yeah, now that we have our to-do component ready, so we can check to-dos as done and then delete them. Only thing left to do for our application now is to actually the functionality for adding to-dos. So let's do that next. So I'll go to the VS Code and to the add new to-do component, and let's start by adding onClick handler for the add button. And for now, I will just add an empty function over there. Let's save this and then check the browser. And as you might have guessed, we are getting an error, and the reason for that error is that this component at the moment is a server component and we are using onClick handler over here, so we need to convert it to client component. So let's do that like this. So now if we save it, go to the browser and refresh the page, the app is working again. Okay, so for this onClick handler, whenever the button is clicked, we want to add a to-do. So let's add a function up here that makes the API request that adds the to-do to the server. Let's call it add to-do, and as a parameter, we just want to get the to-do name. And then again, after the to-do is added, we want to refresh the data as we did with the update and delete. So we want to pass in a refresh function as a second parameter, like this. Then I'll add a fetch request inside of here that makes the API request like this. So again, since this is client component, we can use this shorter syntax for the URL. So /API/todo/add is the endpoint. And then as a body, we want to send the name of the to-do. And after the fetch is completed, we want to refresh the data like this. And then let's call this add to-do function inside of the onClick handler. So add to-do, and the first parameter is the name. And for now, I will just add a string over here saying that to-do 1. And the second parameter is the refresh function from the router, the next router. So let's actually right now import the use router like this. And then we had to still define that router inside of the component with the use router like this. And now we can call that router.refresh, or we can pass it as a parameter for the add to do function over here like this, and it will be called in the function after the fetch is completed. Okay, so I will save this. Let's switch to the browser and test this out. So I will refresh the page and I type something over here. And next I will click the add button, and looks like we get a new to-do over there, but it has the wrong name. And the reason for that is that we didn't send the value of this text input to the server, but we sent just the static text over here. So let's modify this so that we also get the correct name. So up here in the component, I will define a new piece of state like this, and then I still need to import that use state like this, and then we still need to add onChange handler for the input like this. So we are calling the set name with the input value. And let's define a value for the input also, and that should be the name like this. And the last thing to do is actually use that name variable when we call the add to do like this. So let's save it and switch to the browser and try it out. So I'll type in something and click the add. And looks like we get the correct name for the to-do. And let's try to add another one. Looks like it's working, so the name is sent correctly. One thing we could add is that whenever we click the add, we empty this input so that it's easier to add another one. So inside of our button on-click handler, I will modify this a bit like this. So what I did here was after the add to do, we will set the name as empty string. And just to make sure that we set the name after the to do is added, I made this on-click handler an asynchronous function with this, and then we are awaiting the add to do before we are setting the name as empty string. So let's save it and test it out. So let's try to add something and click add button, and looks like the to do is added and the input is cleared. So now we have pretty well functioning to-do list application over here. And as I said earlier, we won't style this any further from here because the focus of this video was on the functionality rather than the styling. I really hope this video was helpful and you learned something from it. And if you did, please let me know in the comments and like the video. And if you are not already, please do hit the subscribe button too. I'll see you in the next video.